Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku, here tonight reading another paper, this time about Amilcar Cabral, going to the people. I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. You guys should be tuning in to other shows on the network, for instance.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. You're listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Also, check out the Queen's Council Podcast as well. Check out the Queen's Council Podcast as well. Let me post a link to the Discord. You guys really should check out the Discord. In the last few days, since having on General Abzu, Machiavelli, A-Love Supreme, those guys have been really coming through and posting a lot of information on crypto, blockchain, NFTs, etc., and what we call the crypto bookshelf or the crypto library of the bookshelf on Discord that we have. You guys should definitely pass through there, check it out. Also, General Abzu posted a lot of information today on our off-topic channel, so go check out those bits of information that's been posted. All right, let me grab the link. If you're not already joined to the Discord, here is the link. There you go. So you guys make sure click the link, check out the Discord, join as soon as you can. Let us know what you want to do. If you want to be just there as a fan of the podcast, or if you want to help work on the curriculum, that's basically two roles that we have on the Discord server. Let me know what you want to do, and I'll definitely give you the proper role so you have the access to the information that's on the Discord. If you're new here, I want you to subscribe to the podcast. Click the bell to be notified. It's weird that some folks who are new come by, listen to a whole show, come back for other shows, never subscribe, never click the bell. Make sure you click the bell and subscribe today. And if you've been here before and you're listening live with me especially, make sure to click the like button. Those likes really do help us. If you listen to the playback, same applies. Click the like button. Okay. Let's move on to today's paper. Going to the people. Amilcar Cabral's Materialist Theory and Practice of Culture and Ethnicity. Here's a quote from Cabral. Always bear in mind that people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in one's head. They're fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. Another quote is, "It is not the existence of a race, an ethnic group, or anything of the kind that define the behaviors of a human aggregate. No, it is the social environment and the problems arising from the reactions to this environment and the reactions of the human beings in question. All this defines the behavior of the human aggregate." Now, if you go back to that first quote from Cabral, that's the thing right there, right? People are fighting to win material benefits, right? This bickering type of stuff I see on social media all the time, or whose thought is the best one. At the end of the day, I want to see material benefit. And when we're talking about nation building, I want to live better. I want to live in a nation where I could live better. And ultimately, I want to live in peace, right? So that's a continuation of a thought I gave in the last episode, right? I see Dorico Cooper Photography is here. I was just talking about General Abzu a second ago. Make sure you guys join the Discord, because that brother has been dropping some gems in the cryptocurrency bookshelf, as well as in the off topics, some interesting stuff that we might have to discuss on the show in the future. All right, you guys make sure to check it out. So the paper starts, "It is now 50 years since Amilcar Cabral wrote his first academic piece on soil erosion in Cabo Verde. These pieces would mark the beginning of his intellectual concern and his lifelong quest for the well-being of the people under colonialism, during the liberation struggle, and in the future that he envisaged for the people of Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau. Today, however, such sentiments and a disposition like the above quotes from Cabral may appear to be both platitudinous and commonplace. In addition, they speak in and of a language that very few people, activists, or academics use today, while implying an aim, the achievement of national liberation and socialist development, that looks almost arcane and appears positively utopian. Yet when set in the context of an engagement with and observation of peoples over a long period of time, Amilcar Cabral stands almost alone among African nationalists. Even if his focus is under the inspiringly challenging conditions of achieving national independence, rather than in the depressing, forbidding environments of post-colonial crisis, he continues to offer some crucial guidance about the importance of identity, how it is formed and situated. One such crisis, as the late Claude Ake put it, is the conflict among nationalities, ethnic groups, and communal and interest groups. All right. The conflict among nationalities, ethnic groups, and communal and interest groups, right, which broke out after the independence and were the resulting struggle for power, was so absorbing that everything else, including development, was marginalized. And that, that goes back to the question I asked in the last episode, right? The question I asked in the last episode was, are continental Africans, what are they really more concerned with? Is it the continent, right? Does that come first to them? Is it the nation that they're from? Or is it their tribe? And as we saw in the last reading, the last paper that I read in the last episode, make sure you guys are going to check that out, give it a like as well. It seems to me that most Africans on the continent are tribe first. KW Don 7 came into the chat room at the end of the show, close to the end of the show, and he added a comment from a brother on the KWAZ show. This brother said that the problem with Nigeria, because we were talking about the trouble with Nigeria last episode. One of the problems that we read about is like Nigeria is divided by religion, right? Islam versus Christianity. And then it's divided by these ethnicities, right? Hausa Fulani in the north, I think it was, Yoruba in the west, you know, another group in the south, etc. And so when folks in Nigeria come to power, they tend to seek out the interests of their ethnic group and or religion. So some House of Fulani folks come into power, they only do stuff really for House of Fulani. All the proceeds that come from Nigeria having oil, one of the biggest oil members of OPEC. And that money, instead of it trickling down evenly to everyone in Nigeria, it's, you know, depending on who's in power, they're going to trickle that down to the ethnicity. And I use Trinidad as a Caribbean example of that, with the blacks, you know, the Africans and the Indians there. Depending on who's in power, blacks don't see much, right? And so KW-7 came in and quoted someone who said that Nigeria won't be fixed or will always be in a struggle because of the goofy, and I like the word and the usage of it here, the goofy religion and the goofy tribalism. The problem with these goofy religions and goofy tribalism is that they take precedence over actual development. The time y'all spend doing that, and the same thing is going on here right now. The time y'all spend arguing about who created hip hop, of all things, right? And I get there's a need for accuracy, don't get me wrong, but the time you spend talking about that and who was the first to do this and who was the first to do that in America and all this old shit, like, you're wasting time on that stuff. You're not dealing with actual development. You're not dealing with economic stability. To continue, the crisis of development and economic stability can, in part, be linked to the crisis of managing ethnic relations and conflict. What did I tell you guys before, and I reiterated it last episode, right? The idea is that you're talking about nation building, you're trying to have peace for your people. And that's it. With peace comes the economic stability, comes further development, comes future development for your children, etc. You're trying to have peace, right? It also, the context of crisis that Francis Deng has in mind when in a recent short piece on ethnicity in Africa, he writes that, quote, except for post-apartheid South Africa, Africans won their independence without negotiating an internal social contract that would win and sustain national consensus. The constitutions for independence were laden with idealistic principles developed outside the continent. The regimes built on them lacked legitimacy and in most cases were soon overthrown with no remorse or regrets from the public. But these upheavals involved only a rotation of like-minded elites, or worse, military dictators, intent on occupying the seat of power, vacated by the colonial masters. Such leaders soon became their colonial masters' images. And that's, you know, that's something we talk about a lot, right? The elites is who really screwed Africa a bunch, right? But even worse was the military dictators, right? And another key point that's being made here as well when the first leaders, post-independence African leaders came about, you have these constitutions that speak, and I talked about this in the last show, that speak vaguely about all the Africans in that now independent or about to be independent nation. But you don't deal with the ethnicity issue that you would have. The problem that a lot of these folks have stems back to, you guys didn't talk to one another. Okay, we get it. The colonizers create these borders, lumped in a bunch of people, not everyone got along historically, etc., etc. But what are we going to do now? If we keep in these borders, we got to figure out a way that everyone is considered in this new nation. After all, what is the point of the whole nation? Is to have peace and protection. These guys dropped the ball. And so we're seeing some of that stuff play out today, right? These guys did not have an internal social contract. Plus the elites who were colonized in their minds already just wanted to carry on what the colonizers were doing. And then you had the military, those who had some military might, who were able to come in and do the same exact thing as the colonial masters. What we hope in reading this paper tonight is an understanding of how you get around the ethnicity, the goofy tribalism, right? And maybe even some of that goofy religion, in order to build a strong nation that's peaceful to its people and protects them and sees them develop. It is not clear that the regimes built on the European type constitutions lack legitimacy at the time of independence or in the immediate thereafter. However, Deng's position, like many others' recent judgments about post-colonial African states, demonstrates a distance gone from the certainties of nationalist optimism 40, 30, and in some cases just 20 years ago. For many, the resonance of a principled and meaningful African nationalism seems far away. The inequities between privileged elites and the masses and the manifest failures of national economic policies have caused Africans to turn away from their central state and to the often divisiveness of African ethnic politics, which re-emphasize their tribal, regional, or other communal identities. So much so that to some, the state is now deemed irrelevant to most people's lives. Cabral, one of Africa's most prescient and principled meaning-giving nationalists, thought extensively about and lived through such problems nearly 30 years ago. He also sought to bring a scrupulous and purposeful nationalism to the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. This vision, and no less his legacy, appears today dilapidated by the many ravages to both the land he so long struggled to liberate and to the intellectual tradition he claimed to inform its practice of emancipation with. It is because of his integrity, his foresight, much less in his practice, as his reflections on them in his writings. However, that he remains one of the most insightful commentators on working out the internal social contract, or at least establishing a foundation for its elaboration. In particular, one way in which he informed an understanding of the groundwork for this compact was through a discerning understanding of culture and ethnicity, the absence of which continues to divide so many African nation states today, and which is indeed one of the reasons for the lack of legitimacy currently found in so many of them. In particular, what is of singular significance for Cabral is the need to understand the context of production within which people work. Although production is clearly not the only aspect of trying to grasp the status of identity in its multiple forms, Cabral would see an intimacy between what people produce, their material interests, and their identity, all of which he believed were historically, not genetically, given. The interaction of class production and culture was an enduring theme of Cabral's political thought and practice. Because of his central interest in the material welfare of impoverished producers, because of the fact that many of these producers serve as the foundation of the national liberation struggle, just as some would be opposed to it, Cabral's practical and normative attention to identity are necessarily implicated in class analysis and production relations. In what follows, I will outline some of the context, both practical and theoretical, which inform Cabral's evolving, but obviously unfinished understanding of the role of identity and of class and ethnicity in particular. Nearly 25 years after his death, Cabral is worth revisiting for both the compass as much as the limitations of his analysis. So this brings us to a section of the paper called Ethnicity, the Resilience Paradigm. In the chat room, Dorico Cooper says we need to be focused on who is not benefiting from the content we create. Imagine if we were benefiting off of ourselves more than others benefit off of us, especially hip hop. See, Dorico Cooper shares my mindset. And instead of you arguing and bickering about, it wasn't your boy from Jamaica, I forget his name now, who created hip hop. It was, hip hop has been practiced, by foundational Black Americans since the 1930s and all that. Dude, you don't own it. You're not fully benefiting from it. I watched an interview with Mystical, the rapper, the other day. And Mystical says, when he first signed, he had some money and he spent that like in 3 months, right? These guys wouldn't say it today. These guys are struggling artists now. They won't say it. Everything is set up to look good and glamorous and all that stuff. Focus on your ownership. Focus on how do you distribute this product called hip hop, especially. How are you going to control the distribution of that of that genre of music? Like Dorico Cooper says, right? If we were benefiting off of ourselves more than others benefit off of us, that would make more sense. I see Daily Affirmations by Pauline join the room. You guys make sure to check out both Dorico Cooper Photography and Daily Affirmations by Pauline. All right. So ethnicity, the resilient paradigm. Most African nationalists sought to avoid serious theoretical and practical engagement with the problems entailed by the relationship between culture and political practice. Consonant with the prevailing modernist assumptions of the time, it was taken for granted that cultural attitudes directly determine political practices. How can you take that for granted? And many nationalists were fearful of its implications. This apprehension was especially true for the understanding of the most directly political cultural manifestation of diversity amongst peoples, ethnicities, often at the time of independence and in the immediate thereafter called tribalism. Shared cultures where often, but not only, language and a mythology of common descent operate to sustain a collective identity and conception of self within a community. So here's the thing too. No one is saying that there's not something to quote unquote tribalism, right? No one's saying that it doesn't connect you with others who share the same culture, who share the same descent, collective identity, and conception of self and all that stuff. No one is saying that that's not important. What folks are saying, what I'm saying primarily, is what's more important? Is it your vein of culture, right? And by vein, I mean your little tribe, or is it the larger people that's more important? And I'm sorry to say, for some people, it's the larger group of people that's more important. Peace to the pro-black perspective. Peace to Rasta, who says, hey, Rasta, have you been here before? I don't remember if you were here before or not, but nice to have you here today all the same. Make sure you guys like the video. Just click the thumbs up real quick. And if you're new here, make sure you hit the subscribe button and click the bell to be notified when I have new content going up. Right? Ultimately, it's a larger group of people that we got to be concerned with. There's a time for being concerned with your, quote unquote lineage or shared culture or what have you. But there's really a time where, and it's most times, where you got to be about the whole group of us. Right? Rasta says that they were here before. Well, thanks for coming back through, Rasta. It'd be nice to see you around more regular, so I don't forget. Many African nationalists invoke the nation ahead of the perceived dangers of tribalism and clan, or national integration over local or regional identity, of secular nationalism over religious affiliation. While Marxist-inspired movements were inclined to emphasize social class rather than ethnicity. Because most African states inherited from colonialism a multiplicity of ethnic groups, the character of African politics was such that national allegiances and state boundaries were rarely coincident. The state primarily solicited a territorial and civic meaning towards the nation. Invoking the ethnos was often received suspiciously as embracing issues of tribal domination and forms of an ethnic maldistribution of resources. The inclination towards stressing national integration over historical and sometimes colonially created or reinforced cultural identities was also a practice reflected in the prevailing Marxist and developmentalist literature, both at the time of national independence and subsequently. Much of the developmentalist literature, for example, held forth about Africa's transition from primitivism to the situation of the modern state, while the indigenous representatives of the independent regimes wish to transform their plans for domestic domination into national integration, whatever the legitimacy they derive from liberation struggles. What frames Shaw's 1986 notion of ethnicity as a resilient paradigm in African studies is that despite periodic shifts in explanatory focus, the existence and saliency of ethnic consciousness in Africa is hardly controversial anymore. Just what constituted and the explanations of how or why the consciousness takes the form that it does, and from the standpoint of policy, how to respond to it. Ethnicity is a highly contested term. Most discussions of ethnicity involve a location within a continuum between two mutually overlapping, although analytically distinct models. The first, the primordial, is where ethnic identity is said to often involve and sustain great emotional group devotion and provide and offer an ongoing emotional balance and a mental environment within and through which the social world is constructed and understood. It provides a narrative of the self by situating it through a network of fundamental and enduring cultural meaning and significance, and by being grounded in an existential cultural logic. The second, instrumental and socially constructed, views ethnicity as frequently expressing itself through instrumental forms, as in much recurrent political and social intercourse, as a vehicle for a group's own material benefit at others' expenses. Ethnicity is viewed as consciousness animated through social, economic, and political practices that are bound in some way to power and interest, and where the very nature of it being made active can point to its contingent, contextual, uncertain, and historically constructed nature. Ethnicity, like any social, economic, and political identity or network, is not a natural given, but must be built through investment in procedures directed to the regulation of group identities and relations, usable as a likely source of benefits to the groups themselves, and or those who either support or profit from the groups, and against others who might benefit or seek to exclude. I hope you guys follow that. There's a lot said there, but it makes sense. Both basic models also contain implicitly or explicitly normative judgments as to how things ought to be. Respectively, that differences between people should be acknowledged as facts of life, and that rather than attempt ethnicity as given, it ought to be explained as a constructed identity. At any point along the lines between the poles of the conceptual, heuristic, and normative spectrum, there is also concern with various kinds of boundary configuration between groups. Particularly, there is the interest in the cultural composition of the groups, the nature of exclusiveness and inclusivity of group relationships, and inequality between them, as well as to the extent to which these boundaries are maintained exogenously, perhaps through the state, possibly through the control over resources by others, or through practices utilized from within, having to do with, for instance, class differentiation and or gender control. Whatever variable is used, it devolves into a view of ethnicity in terms of how societies, social systems, or structures function, or structure, and those who approach it in terms why people do the things that they do, or agency. That is the relationship between the institutions, values, practices, and resources within a community to sustain it, and why collectively communities behave and act in the ways that they, for example, rebel or resist the pressure to do so. Presently, most who use the concept of ethnicity to categorize social and political fields and practices would probably concur with Komaroffs in saying that at the most general level, ethnicity is the product of specific historical processes and tends to take on the quote-unquote natural appearance of an autonomous force, of a quote-unquote principle capable of determining a whole social life. In short, although in flux and mutable, ethnicity as consciousness and as practice contains a powerful stock of emblematic or symbolic resources and effectics, language, religion, a kinship system, which are often, though not only, made most manifest in political, economic activities. Right? And it's right there. Because these things tend to show their ass, right, during political and economic activities, this is why on some levels you have to mute ethnicity. You have to mute tribalism, right? I see some folks are here in the chat room today. to have you guys here. I see Kevin Care 42 joining the room tonight. NYC Beauties is here. KW Don 7 is in the room. KW Don 7 says Cool Herc. That's a brother I was trying to remember. Cool Herc is considered a founding godfather of hip hop, along with Bambaataa. Jericho Cooper Photography says, speaking of tribalism, what is going on in Ethiopia right now? The only country on the continent that has never been colonized by an outside force, and they're fighting and killing each other. NYC Beauties is here, says greetings. Rasta says, in order to change this world, our circumstances, we have to just change our minds in order to transform this earth and our fate, because like attracts like. As long as black folks' minds are reversed, we are not going to make it. Change your minds, or our minds, change your or our circumstances. I agree with that. Daily Affirmations agrees with Rasta as well. She totally agrees. Black Excellence also agrees with Rasta. Same thing with Kevin Care 42. Rasta says it is so simple, but we are making it so difficult for ourselves. Greatness is always found in the simple thing. Kevin Care says to Rasta, many of us are still going through the deprogramming. Daily Affirmation says, listen to these lessons is so vital to strengthening our diaspora. And Kevin Care 42 says something I agree with. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Help this channel to grow. And that's something you guys should do. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Help this channel to grow. And if you do that, I thank you very much for doing so. Okay? The thing is, here's the thing. Like Rasta said, the fix is really, on paper, simple. The fix in reality, though, is convoluted. Because the savages who have created these issues, who created these systems and these systemic issues, right, have done so in such a way that, as simple as the fix is on paper, most people can't see it. Most people can't see it. I saw a brother, I talked about this in the last episode, a brother on Twitter, and I'm sure he was well-meaning in his comment, but he said something like, yo, you want me to give up my tribe just to be black? Right? We talking thousands of years of history, and you want me to give that up just to be black? Listen to the wording, just to be black. As if being a part of that tribe makes you something greater than black. And this is why I say continental Africans put tribe over everything. The next thing after tribe, it seems to be religion. And then after that is nation. The continent itself as a whole, this is why Pan-Africanism is still like a theory. It's still a dream. Africans sitting on all that wealth, all those resources, natural resources, should have been got together and said, nah, we drawing the line. And you any European or whoever else cross that line is a problem. You should have been done the work you were supposed to do. And that's why there's so much pushback against even the concept, the dream of Pan-Africanism. To continue, whatever the debate's about is conceptual status. No one seriously believes that ethnicity can simply be seen as an expression of the introductory phase of development to be outmoded by modernization, and cannot be seen, simpliciter, as false consciousness or, quote, the manipulation of colonists, imperialists, or even the incumbents of the contemporary state. And even Marxist political scientists now recognize this, as the analysis of concrete historical situations inevitably comes up against this point. One simply bows to the evidence. Cabral's experience and analysis are so pertinent here in that he was someone who studied and analyzed specific socioeconomic situations. He also combined a view of ethnicity in terms of how societies, social structures, and institutions function and why people act in the way in which they do. Was both under specified circumstances a developmentalist and someone who used materialist and very often Marxist concepts, albeit amended ones, to explore concretely the relationship between identities and people's socioeconomic environments. And he also sought to meld these identities to some shared conception of an emerging nation space in the process of a national liberation struggle that was rooted in conception of common citizenship, but which did not deny the entitlements of identity, right? That's exactly what I was saying earlier, right? You can acknowledge the common citizenship. You don't have to deny people their ethnicity, their ethnic identity, or what have you. But when it comes to doing the work, you got to put some of that shit to the side, right? And I know it sounds cold-blooded, but it's the same thing. If we talking cricket, right, you're gonna send the West Indies to play cricket. We don't care how many, we don't care, who's a Jamaican, who's an Antiguan, right? Who's a Trinidadian, a Bayesian, you don't care. We just want a strong team, right? And we get that by getting the best of the best from each nation. We ain't got time to worry about who don't like Junkanoo, who don't like Pan, who don't like, reggae or some shit like that. Let's get to work. And that's really what it's about. Right? Also, I want to share too something interesting here, that we're reading about Amilcar Cabral, right? And we're reading about, his thoughts on identity and ethnicity, etc. But do y'all know primarily Cabral was a poet, and an engineer, right? He was like a agricultural engineer, right? But it goes to show you that, and this is the thing that our children need to understand, you don't have to just be one thing. You don't have to just be one thing. I see that too often. We got some smart folks who are black folks, but all they do is the one thing that they do. They're a doctor or they're a lawyer or whatever they are, right? But they never do anything outside of that one thing. And a guy like Cabral is a good example of, you could do multiple things, right? You could study in college and, do whatever, be a biologist or whatever, but you could do other things. And that's something I want to point out too. The guy was an agricultural engineer, he was a poet, but he also was a revolutionary thinker, right? And you can inspire yourselves or your children or grandchildren to do the same. You can do more than one thing. Anyway, to continue, we're in this section called From Practice to Theory. It had been Fanon who had suggested that more specific knowledge is required about the people to avert the pitfalls of the subject. The subaltern of decolonization becoming the object of the post-colonial state, which in so many African countries it has become rather than citizens of nationalist promise. Right? In Cabral, we have a thinker and activist who whose focus was always specific and who provided us with an elaborate analysis and understanding of the social and economic circumstances of the peoples whom he saw as the eventual constituencies for a viable nation or national political space. Understand the people. Understand the people, right? Like Fanon before him, Cabral's political theory began with a critique of colonialism and the limits of the nationalism he saw elsewhere in Africa in the middle 1960s to the early 70s before his death in 1973. This critique was a political critique. It emphasized an alternative set of political values, practices, and institutions that were to be actualized in the emerging nation state. His critique was also a cultural critique. Cabral often spoke of the way in which colonialism, at its very core, organized the constant repression of the cultural life of the people as being, which for him meant that the reassertion of a commitment to cultural traditions has to be at the center of both anti-colonialism and authentic, pluralistic, post-colonial state and society. To do so required an understanding of people's experience as a means of formulating a practicable theory of resistance. I like that there. Right? We often talk about study the enemy. We gotta talk more about study your allies too. You know, study your soldiers, study your people, right? An opposition to any separation between theory and practice, or between thought and experience, so rarely heard today in Africa, informs this vision critique. Theory disassociated from concrete circumstances and disengaged from practice was politically unproductive. His views on and approach to ethnicity must be seen in this light, as must anything that Cabral wrote. Cabral rarely conceived of theory for its own sake, divorced from the ongoing concerns of decolonization and building of a new state and society. For this reason, the central nationalist metaphors of Cabral have thought a return to the source and unity and struggle can also be supplemented by unity and differentiation. For in his thought, Cabral conceptualized what he saw in practice: difference and division, contrast, nuance, and contradiction everywhere, whether classes or ethnicities, whether between genders, or whether elders and juniors, or between religions. Central themes in its thought and practice are a return to the source of indigenous cultures within which one finds the resistance for the unity and struggle against colonialism. They are not, however, the undifferentiated abstract culturalism of cultural nationalists, nor the instrumentalist appeal to unity of traditional nationalists. Like the supple, practical dialectician he was, he saw opposites as contraries, not to be entirely replaced, but rather integrated into a nation state that diminished conflict, but recognized difference. See, I could get down with that. Right? And again, you know, at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, really it's about identifying your enemy. Once you identify the enemy, and you all are all solid and understand and agree upon who is the enemy, you could have whatever tribes you really want, to be honest. The fact of the matter is your focus will be on the enemy, right? The problem with us is that a lot of us, or not enough of us, focus on who is the enemy. Instead, we focus on, and because we don't focus on who's the enemy, you know, the enemy outside of us, right? We tend to create enemies within us, right? And that's really the problem. Cabral's thought expressed what he imputed to be the multiply variable lived experience of peoples as they struggle against colonial oppression and as they struggle to unify themselves as a nation people, to overcome without completely discarding specific local, cultural, and class differences that might divide those who inhabit a nation to be. Thus, so before I go on, essentially what Cabral was looking at, right, was, you know, there's differences, there's different peoples or what have you, but because we're trying to get to this nation, you know, this nation to be, right, we're going to work, right, we're going to work to unify people as a nation people. We're going to look past, not to ignore, but we're going to look past these differences and instead focus on the goal, which is a nation. And that's the second thing our folks aren't really focusing on. We're not focused on who the enemy is, and we're not focused on building a nation. Thus, despite his nation-state project, Cabral was first and foremost a cultural pluralist by practical necessity and consequences, and by normative disposition. If he wished to return to the source of the people for the purpose of not only the achievement of independence, but national liberation, he couldn't be anything less. Ultimately, Cabral, like all African nationalists, saw the dangers of ethnicity, of ethnic divisiveness, and like all African nationalists, he sought what one might call a secular conclusion to the dilemmas and choices that ethnicity represent, without giving up a conception of multicultural citizenship. Whereas other Africans kind of ignored, right, the multicultural aspect of their nation to be, he leaned into it, right? He studied it more, right? And he engaged going forward based on what he learned. Okay? In the chat room, I see there's some activity. KW7 said, I would argue that Ethiopia was colonized by Italy leading up to and during World War II. We could argue that. We could argue that. I mean, they definitely, how do I put it? They definitely had control of it for a moment. But yeah, that can be argued. Kevin Care42 says the key word should be compromise. We need to come to a middle ground. Tribalism does not serve us anymore. Black Excellence says Paul Robeson was a lawyer, activist, actor, singer, and athlete as well. All right. Black Excellence goes on to say Gordon Parks was a poet, photographer, writer, director, and painter. All right. Rasta says tribalism is like polygamy to the mating of multiple. But as man evolved, he have to move from the animal state of polygamy to monogamy, because polygamy is the quality of animals, just like that. Unity means supreme consciousness. The pro-black perspective says know your enemies and know yourself. Exactly. Rasta says, I think it goes both ways. Know yourself, therefore you know your enemies. Well, I mean, both of those things can be true, and I like it. All right? If you know who you are, then you know who you ain't. Right? If you know who you are, then you know who you are not. And who you are not is your enemy. Right? Kevin Care42 says to KW7, Italy occupied Ethiopia. Yeah, that's the word I was trying to find. They occupied them for a spell. Dorico Cooper Photography says they occupied Ethiopia but never colonized Ethiopia. yeah, there's definitely an occupation. Colonization is, you know, we can argue that point. I want to thank you guys for tuning in tonight. As always, it's always a pleasure to have you guys here with me as I do these live streams. I hope this paper is interesting to everyone. If it's interesting to you guys on the live stream, give me a quick thumbs up. I hope you guys are getting something out of it. Let's continue. The starting point for any understanding of the premises of Cabral's political thought and practice is then empirical and even biographical. This need not detain us here, except to point out, as several commentators have, that much of Cabral's theory came from his methodological self-consciousness born out of his discrete, concrete, and specific studies of the people of his country. When is the last time that we've really studied the people of our countries? Like, when is the last time, let's say, anyone here has studied the people of Nigeria, or the people of the Bahamas, or the people of Jamaica, or something like that, right? We gotta start really studying our people, because these folks study us. You know the enemy? That enemy studies you, right? Such circumstances prevented Cabral from having any preconceptions about the blueprint of analysis and determine outcome, an outcome not to be theoretically prejudiced, in addition to his practice being an effective equivalent to his theory. The details of his experience and the intellectual, as opposed to the emotional, commence with his agronomic surveys for the Portuguese government in the 1940s and 50s, where he gained a detailed knowledge of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde's ecological and agronomic conditions, and thus of its peoples. I don't think, and this is one of the problems I have with research and researchers. I look at a lot of black researchers, folks with PhDs doing research, and I'm looking at what they're researching, and I'm like, where's the specificity to your people? Like, none of these folks work on any models that apply to a black situation. They're not working on any solution to a black, health problem, medical problem, or what have you. And that just really grinds my gears. And here we have Cabral studying, right, the conditions, the ecology of these lands, right? And through studying the land, you get more knowledge of the people. This knowledge allowed him to draw upon detailed, if provisional, categories of the population of Guinea-Bissau and the Cabo Verde Islands, the property, the productive practices, and the forms of social and political authority in the countryside. However, Cabral's compilation of fact and statistics obviously was not purely academic scholarship, but reflected his concern for his first-hand view of what he believed was the existing experiences of the colonized. Carrera, for instance, has told us that the oral literature of notoriously powerful storms and unpredictable rainfall patterns across the densely populated islands of Cabo Verde, or Cape Verde, a literature full of motifs that saw drought, forced migration by the colonial state, and emigration as synonymous evils, a literature of which Cabral was acutely aware. From his father, Cabral derived a deep interest both in the folk traditions of the islands as well as in their agricultural and ecological problems that developed his later interest in agronomy. Cabral's politics were the result of the compulsion of experience. Quote, that I saw folk die of hunger in Cabo Verde, and I saw folk die of flogging in Guinea with sticks, beatings, and forced labor. This is the entire reason for my revolt. That's Cabral in 1969. There was every reason for Cabral to be sensitive about identity and identities and how the African ones might coalesce politically to overcome such brutality and become nation agents and autonomously self-determining Africans again. Cabral realized that the re-Africanization of the minds of a people must take place both within the context of a dialogue between the Europeanized intellectual, the assimilado, and the majority of the rural uneducated peoples. And thus for the assimilado, national independence was one of the ways of becoming Africans once again, to return to our African roots, but only by establishing relationships with non-civilized Africans. Cabral questioned whether his education, assimilado status, meant that he had to avoid turning his back on his people, which meant, of course, getting to know the African producers for whom colonialism was an infinitely more oppressive burden. What Cabral saw was one of the principal lacunae in post-colonial Africa was the absence of a common compact or identity to wed the people and the political elite who had nominally spoken for the mass of the people during the independence struggles. Any repossession of self entails confronting the fact of repression of the identity of the people for any withdrawal into a hypothetical pre-colonial cultural evades the realities that colonized peoples face individually and collectively. These harsh material realities are distant from the psychological, apolitical concern for identity, so often characteristics of cultural nationalism, and so increasingly being reinvented in today's Africa and amongst its post-colonial expatriates. The return to the source for Cabral is then a collective act, though it is not one of unanimity. The repossession of self requires a broadly based movement, one built upon and infused with a plurality that cannot be based upon narrow class, nor upon parochially tribal, as opposed to cultural traditions. For Cabral, a broadly based political movement is fundamentally one that involves a class struggle in that war of liberation. In that war of liberation was necessarily a class struggle, given that the vast majority of Africans were rural producers, and those who exploited them were merchant capitalists, conjoined to the colonial state. Colonial social relations were antagonisms rooted in the way people are situated in the social organization of production. But the organization production and of classes are composed of different ethnicities and culture. Different ethnicities and cultures. Cultures which, however related, have different traditions and different existential realities. However differentiated, or however in fact they are homogenized. Hence, Cabral thought that while the theory and practice of nationalism had to be supplemented by an analysis of politics and class, conversely, class politics must be supplemented by analysis of cultural differences and the various communities within which these identities were located, and indeed often separated from and in conflict with each other. It should be clear as we proceed that Cabral had no fixed notion of culture, and his notions were situational and variable within the context that he saw communities and societies. He also oscillates between and uses at the same time culture as social customs, practices, and values, and culture as the meanings people evoke or produce from their experiences, or how people make sense of their worlds regardless of their environments and circumstances. Normatively, he had a commitment to engage the perspectives and the practices because they are what peoples live by. And for Cabral, therefore, are their cultures. They also constitute the strength and identity of the various peoples, including even some of the customs and traditions which, by Western judgment, contain elements of ungrounded, contradictory beliefs rooted in different rationalities from those of the quote-unquote modern. I should state now, however, that Cabral was not a cultural relativist. He never said all cultural perspectives or practices are equally true, and he did not seek to understand each culture exclusively in its own terms. Rather, he attempted to understand cultures in the same way, and it would be a requirement of his methods of research that he leave each perspective and practice equally open to examination. Any return would involve engaging the content of those beliefs and those who held them, those who had, according to Cabral, been least touched by colonialism, the people from the rural areas. And in this regard, Cabral was fortunate in a way rare among European educated Africans and nationalists anyway. As an agronomist, he had the first-hand experience of his country's people, geography, economy, agriculture, and society. This brings us to a section called the production of material culture. We check in with the chat. The chat room is saying, Derico Cooper Photography says they occupied Ethiopia, but they never colonized Ethiopia. Goes on to say monogamy sounds good in theory. However, that was a family structure forced upon us by our colonizers for economic reasons. Don't get it twisted. If you take polygamy too far, you end up losing your way. That's true. Rasta says, I mean, he wasn't telling lies. I'm slowly becoming a Putin fan. But both rulers are not to be trusted full or at all. Rasta goes on to say, I was just making an example comparison. I was just saying to say that tribalism caused division, but unity caused harmony and peace. Rico Cooper says, I feel you. Rasta says, we humans have to come at peace by uniting. Simple as that. But world peace starts with the unity of Africa. So that leads me to a question I'm going to ask you guys. That's a little, it's a little off the topic, but it comes from what Rasta just said, right? As we as Africans, right, who are trying to make Africa a powerhouse, make Africa a nation, right? Are we concerned with world peace by creating, this African nation? Is that really what we're concerned with? Or are we concerned with, with taking our place amongst powerful nations and powerful peoples? To be able to move through the world the way we want to move through the world, and to have protection and see protection and development, etc., for our future generation. What I'm really getting at is, let's imagine Africa as this powerful nation. Are we concerned with Russians and what's that group next to them again? Ukrainians in skirmishes? Are we really concerned with that? You guys answer in the chat. I'll touch back with you guys in a second. The production of material culture. While most African nationalists were either mobilizing and extorting sections of their populations for eventual independence, or lyrically promoting the sonorities of negritude and various forms of cultural nationalism, Cabral had, by the late 1940s, already written on problems of soil erosion in Cabo Verde. He had also toured the latter in the Ghanaian countryside to begin investigating at first hand the nature of the indigenous people's social and productive systems, the politics that molded them together or kept them apart, and the impact of the chain colonial commodity production upon them. He displayed a remarkable prescience both before and after he was asked by the Portuguese to draw up the detailed food and agriculture organizations, or the FAO, census outlining the agricultural conditions of Guinea's people. You see, if you're going to be nation building, you have to know how you're going to feed your people, right? So you would need to know the ecology, the makeup of the land, right? You need to know things like the weather systems. Is there drought? Is there heavy rains? Etc. Because again, big part of having a nation is being able to give your people their basic needs, of which is food, right? In his first agricultural pieces, written while a student, Cabral maintained that soil erosion in Cabo Verde Islands was the principal and indirect cause of the drought and famine that had afflicted the countryside. Cabral had a peculiar moral anthropology. Here, and in some of his more technical writings on agriculture, Cabral displayed an enormous sensitivity to those who make their living by agriculture from the land. As usual, his considerations were never merely technical, but concerned with problems that derive from the absence of development, and as a consequence, the hardships of those who work the land. For instance, in his In Defense of the Land, he asserted that the best way of defending the land is the best way of defending people. Let me say that one more again. For instance, in his In Defense of the Land, he asserted that the best way of defending the land is the best way of defending people. Land is liberation, folks, right? How you defend that land is exactly how you defend the people. Cabral had concerns for an ecological balance between people and nature, and for increased productivity in order to improve the living conditions of the people. Cabral's agricultural survey thus began his understanding of the relationship between a people's culture, what they produced, the character of the producing techniques available to them, and people's development. Right? Again, you ain't got time to be worried about the differences. Let's get to the things, right, that we all have to worry about. Let's get to these problems and solving them. And by the very nature of these relationships, Cabral's focus would be identifying groups of people by markers considered ethnic, one aspect of which would be production. His census contains a detailed breakdown of the people into ethnic groups and administrative units, of the amount and kind of agricultural holdings, of the areas under cultivation, crops planted, and the kinds of rotation used. Even in the short summary and overview of the census that is available in English and French, there is a wealth of detail showing how Cabral had an intimate knowledge of the productive practices, the material basis for the social organization and activities of the peoples of Guinea. For instance, even though there were over 25 ethnic groups in Guinea, must we have so many ethnic groups? In Guinea, over 87% of all holdings were held by four major ethnic groups: the Balantes, essentially rice growers; the Fulas and Mandingas, disproportionately dry rice and ground nut producers; and the Manjakas, who, like the Balantes, were essentially rice and dry rice producers. These four groups constituted 85% of the population, with two, the Fulas and the Balantes, holding 2/3 of all land holdings between them. Although Cabral did not engage in any detailed social analysis here, other figures also suggest how much more closely some ethnic groups like the Balantes were to the chain of commodity production of cash crops for export established by colonialism than others. In part because of this proximity, they had developed an identity over time based upon common territory. and the salience of identifiable characteristics and differences from others, such as the Fulas and the Mandingas. When combined with this latter brief analysis of the social structure of Guinea, these figures might be seen to suggest a measure of the degree of reluctance or the difficulty that certain ethnic groups, at the behest of those within a given community who had benefited from the expansion of commodity production, would show about getting involved in the struggle against foreign exploitation. What is one of the principal implications of this analysis, especially when apparently buttressed by the survey, it was that ethnicities framed within, though not formed by colonialism, are partly, but most evidently, mobilized and reconfigured politically and economically by and through their relationship to the state and or the market. Their degrees of inclusion within, exclusion from, their benefit from, and oppression within and under them. Perhaps this observation might seem obvious enough, but it had not been said before, and certainly not by nationalists. That's the thing. This is why you need to understand the people in your nation to be. Right? The people in your nation to be. Because you don't get to build a nation without treaties, without compromises, and you got to know how to approach people with your terms in a treaty or in a compromise. You have to know what can I give you, right, for us to get this. You see? And so you have to understand your people, and thus you also have to understand your enemy as well. Sometimes in a nation, building a nation, you got to work with some of your enemies sometimes, right? If you're building a nation that's not close to the sea, not close to the ocean, you may have to work with, let's say, the enemy who's closest to the sea to be able to get a path, to be able to get, commodities from the sea. And in return, because you're more inward on the land, there's certain crops you can grow because your soil isn't salted, isn't saline, right? So you have the ability to say, well, we have these ground nuts or whatever, right? Things that you like to eat. So that's why you have to understand your people. You have to understand the people involved, right? But again, I contend you don't have to necessarily give in to every ethnic tradition. Cabral saw ethnic tradition, not speaking of ethnic tradition, Cabral saw ethnic tradition not as fixed customs, but as growing out of material and symbolic interests, over conflicts, both internal and external, to given communities, and over the resources, both material and symbolic, that are generated from these relationships. Cabral's purview of ethnicity is clearly not primordialist. That is, that identities are not in some way necessary, unequivocal, and immutable, but they are part of an evolving set of social relations that are linked to that are linked to production relations. However, as we shall also see later, identities are not simply situational, instrumental, and mutable either. Cabral understood the symbolic side of both authority and identity, too, even within small peasant communities. Cabral also showed that there were over 85,000 agricultural family holdings. Even though there was some variation between the largest and smallest land holding unit amongst the various peoples, between approximately 6.5 and 1.6 hectares, by any standards, they could all be classified as small holding units. Whatever else characterized and differentiated these communities, Cabral was dealing with small peasant type farming. Thus, while Cabral did not engage in social analysis here, it is apparent that at this stage of his descriptions of Guinea, he seemed to think that the relative smallness of farm size differentiation and the presence of a uniformly low agricultural technique and output was more important in characterizing people than their ethnic differentiation or even some incipient class formation. Here, then, one directly sees how Cabral is casting ethnicity in this context as a dependent variable. The scale of or extent of economic production likely determines the status of the salience of ethnicity. Although he doesn't specify the degree to which or how this might happen, and tied into his latter remarks on the nature of authority systems within communities, we can see the beginnings of a class analysis of ethnicity too. Containing explicit criticisms of colonial agricultural policies, as well as having prescriptions to overcome the problems caused by Portuguese neglect. Cabral's census also noted that many producers were being forced to shift away from traditional cropping techniques and subsistence crops. They were forced to move out of food crops like rice and to move into monocropping, particularly the growing of groundnuts, especially among certain groups like the Fulas. As a result, Guinea's economy depended on the value of the product within fluctuations of the international market, which also tied certain groups either through pervasive destitution that contributed to the migration to towns and a commodity chain to be preeminent in the production of certain commodities and the eventual urban class locations. Indeed, although Cabral never mentions this, one very significant inference of his analysis is that fluctuations in international markets will have both national and ethnic effects, and that certain interests must necessarily develop out of these relations in the commodity chain. Commodity chains and development are deeply implicated in the formation and development of ethnicity. Interesting. The wide variety of crops grown by different ethnic groupings in Guinea was for Cabral also testimony to the peasants' good sense in bringing about variations in planning. The variation of crops suggested the possibilities for a country whose production would, for some foreseeable future, be in agriculture, though not, he optimistically thought, one characterized by low yields and low returns. In an article on soil conservation, Cabral showed the absolute and relative contributions of the different peoples of Guinea to agriculture, without assigning any superiority or inferiority to the various groups of producers. He showed again that there is a general equality prevailing in the conditions of production among the different peoples, but that the relative skills and knowledge of these groups led to economic differentiation among and within them. Cabral was here less interested in the ethnic dimension to politics, an interest which would come later during the liberation struggle, and more in the relative equality in the general low level of the conditions of production and agricultural technique. However, we should note this important, even again obvious observation, that however comparatively equal the resources over production within and between communities, that variation leads to social differentiation within and perhaps without economic resources. Thus, although Cabral's descriptive, interpretive, agronomic surveys came out of a need to depict the agrarian basis of the colonial commodity economy, it was also rooted in his own moral developmentalism, where technique is an instrument of popular welfare, and within which one can see both a culture of production and foundations of a sociology of identity, formation, and development. This brings us to a section called Trying to Integrate Class and Culture. Checking in with the chat room. The pro-black perspective says being powerful. I'm not sure when he said that, but he says being powerful. Oh, okay. I think that's an answer to my question about are we organizing to create a powerful Africa, a powerful nation in Africa because we care about, you know, subsequently creating peace among all nations. I think we really should be just be checking for being powerful. All right. Rasta says we have no choice but to do so. To make the world peaceful of Africans, it is our fate. Because the world will not leave us alone if we do not make that peace, not only with Africa, but including this whole world. I'm not sure I quite follow the logic there. All right? The world won't have us at peace, but we have to create the peace. The world doesn't give us peace. They won't leave us alone. Right? So we have to create the peace that will make them leave us alone. I prefer to gain the power. Rasta goes on to say it all depends of black people because the other races are depending on us. We owe them that, especially the darker races like the Aborigines of Australia, who has their continent invaded and destroyed. Let me read that again. It all depends of black people because the other races are depending on us. We owe them that, especially the darker races like the Aborigines of Australia, who has their continent invaded and destroyed. Derico Cooper Photography, I don't follow that either. Derico Cooper Photography says, when we have the power, we will create global peace and harmony because we are the most peaceful people on the planet. If we were not, there would not be any colonizers still walking this earth. You see, that's the problem I have too. When I think of this power paradigm, I don't necessarily think of Africans in this power paradigm as some aggressors to the rest of the earth, although, you know, it is what it is if that is what happens. But I think that power paradigm will always create contention from these other folks. And I think these other folks will always then view us especially as their enemy. Right? I remember Dr. John Henry Clark talking about the Romans used to greet each other and say stuff like, you know, I am a Roman citizen and Africa is my enemy. You know, Carthage is my enemy, right? I think these folks will still have their problem, and they'll still be looking to snipe us for having power. Because one of the things, and I saw Onita say post this a couple weeks back, and it's absolutely true, and you could see it in one of these former U.S. presidents' writings, right? The fear of retribution is really their thing. That's the thing they're really afraid of. If we get power, there's a fear of retribution. And I think that if we get power, they're just going to show up what they have already going on, you know, and try to antagonize, if not try to topple the power that we build. So I think we got to dig in and get ready for wars and, you know, external wars and rumors of war going forward. Rasta says, it is like nature has forced us into this position to save not only Africa, but the whole world, including to bring peace on earth. Because no one will do that if not the black race doesn't do it. Rasta says nature has chosen black people. Okay. Derico Cooper Photography says our ability to issue reward and punishment is what power is. I agree. But we know the enemy, right? The enemy is always gonna be scornful of us. Rasa says, damn, it sounds like I am defending the other races. Yeah, kinda, brother, yeah. Or sister, kinda. I'm saying they will still attack us even if we create peace in Africa. So we have to protect ourselves from them. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Derico Cooper Photography says we are not like them. we will never enslave any other race. We will never enslave any other race. I will say though, we have to put on a stern face that, you know, that basically says we won't be afraid to, because we are not gonna go back to this shit again. That's the key thing. I want future Africans to have that mentality. You maybe deep inside you don't want to do that kind of thing. I get it, but you have to put on that brave face to be like, dude, cross the line, see what happens, and get these folks to back up off you. But we don't want to go through this shit again. I think everyone in the room will agree with me. We don't want to have to go through this again. You know what, guys? Let me take a quick station ID break here. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Also, make sure to check out the Queen's Council on KWAZ Radio. Also, tomorrow, as part of his weekly worship, the Pro-Black Perspective is discussing another Affiong speech. You guys should check in. The last one he did on the sister was really great. As a matter of fact, I had asked a question on Twitter: who are the 5 best or top Pan-Africanists ever? Cabral was one. Toure was one. Marcus Garvey, of course. Nyere, and I added her as well. If you look at the banner on our YouTube channel or Facebook or Twitter, you'll see it's stylized a certain way, but you'll see the new banner up with those 5 faces. So make sure to tune into that show tomorrow, and listen to the brother break down her speech. In the chat room, Rico Cooper says, don't get it twisted. We will spank them when they get out of line. That is what power will do for you. That's true. We must break their ability to control the 9 areas of activity. Absolutely. Right? We have to definitely be willing to prevent this that has happened from ever happening again. So we're at this section of the paper called Trying to Integrate Class and Culture. Cabral was modest about his own social and cultural analysis of Guinea, and often showed occasional deference to, or claimed ignorance of, Marxism. Cabral never rejected received theory, the experience or insights of others to court. Deference to others' theories had its costs, however, since in every case practice comes first, and theory after. If you really want to advance the struggle, you must really make a critical assessment of the experience of others before applying their theories. That's a quote from Cabral. But only from a detailed knowledge of the conjunction of their social and cultural milieu and their productive systems and practices. Such were the minimally sufficient conditions for ensuring people's support. Cabral believed that practical theory could only derive from contact with the work and struggles of the grassroots. Of the willingness to maintain his contact, Cabral wrote, quote, having to live day by day with the various peasant groups in the heart of the rural populations, come to know the people better. They discover at the grassroots the richness of the cultural values, the philosophic, political, artistic, social, and moral, acquire a clearer understanding of the economic realities of the country and of the problems, suffering, and hopes of the popular masses. That's why I personally, I can't stand to listen to anyone who's really not around the people. When I look at folks, and I'm not knocking abundance, as you know, I started the year off talking about health, wealth, and relationships. I'm not knocking abundance, but when I look at people sitting in gated communities around, you know, Arabs and Eurasians and whatnot, those folks cannot be doing the work for the people. They're not around them, right? Cabral's social cultural analysis and theory arose from political involvement with people because his main interests lay in addressing the developmental needs of his people fighting for independence. In itself, there is nothing remarkable or profound here. When theory serves to explain the constraints people have in political action, and there are grounds for social classes and or ethnic groups to participate in a liberation struggle, then theory almost tautologically begins by reflecting on the interaction of these groups and actors. Moreover, Cabral's analysis was placed within such areas as culture and ethnicity, variables hitherto rarely treated in Marxist as well as contemporary revolutionary analyses of national liberation. Where these subjects were treated, such an analysis often cleaved to assumptions about history and class, the implications of which many African nationalists found questionable and at times objectionable. It is Cabral's views on these issues that in part have generated the seemingly pointless debates over his putative Marxism. Thus, the circumstances which led Cabral to his conceptions of class and culture were many and complex. The ethnic mix of Guinea and the manner in which peasant and ethnic communities interacted or didn't, the way they had been brought into the commodity chain, and how their lives had been affected thereby, all intersected in a way to make the peasants, or many of them, cautious about even revolt, let alone national liberation and making it their own. The specific grounds to motivate popular struggle could be found in a pre-existing theory. A theory supposed to be true independently of its correspondence to practice cannot be selected to guide a struggle, since it would impose an extraneous idea upon that struggle. And if it is untrue, then, unless prevented by luck, it must misguide those who are direct the struggle and those who are being guided by it. Here was Cabral's simple methodological message in eschewing abstract theory. If Gramsci's understanding of hegemony came from his careful reading of Italian history and society, rather than from previously worked out theorems, then so did Cabral's notion of cultural resistance. In his methodological principle in analyzing classes, Cabral also set out to understand who the various classes in Guinea were, to analyze their role within the social structure of colonial social relations, and in what ways antagonisms were implanted in the way people are situated in the social organization and production, and then try to mark out their possible roles within the anti-colonial struggle and their political and economic inclinations for post-colonialism. The starting point for this analysis would be the differences between the city and the rural dwellers of Guinea. Production is a central variable in explaining how people come to see the world, how they relate to others and those of their kind. Production is a central variable in explaining how people come to see the world, how they relate to others and those of their kind. For instance, We know that the conditions of the petty bourgeoisie existence shaped the way in which people interacted with each other, gave them a proximity to the colonial regime, and a closer look at its racial repression and links to the quote-unquote outside world than was possible for the peasantry. Okay, point made. Yet while production can be at the basis of human interaction, it cannot be understood solely in terms of where it is produced. The site of production, its closeness to the centers of colonial, post-colonial power, is a decisive factor in the culture or consciousness of a class or group. In this regard, culture, as Angel Mukandabantu in 1983 has suggested, has both material and practical foundations in production and how people cope with the world, resist or adapt to outside encroachment. While there is never a one-to-one correspondence between production and culture for Cabral, he did want to assert that there was an important affinity between the way in which people produce and their outlook on life and the world. As with his earlier discussion of the relationship between agricultural production and people's use of the land, Cabral emphasized that a mode of production, or the manner in which and by which people produce, is a way of life or culture. I am unsure how informed Cabral might have been by Marx's first thesis on Feuerbach, which emphasizes the underlying unity of all of social life as practical activity. Cabral essentially disowns the notion that social existence can be demarcated or entirely ordered into discrete social, cultural, and economic domains, even where analytically there is a need to differentiate these spheres. Rather than always examine the various ways in which the relationship between superstructure and substructure are related and expressed, Cabral, to bring him sociologically up to date, like Bordeaux after him, argues that the two realms are not so distinct at all. Indeed, he strives to set out how material and symbolic practices are integrated, and in so doing stresses the basic singularity of social life. He viewed culture as intertwined with development or increased well-being, and culture as practical, material, and symbolic, but contestable, like identities themselves. Because the peasantry is both the subject and object of development. Cabral's pathway to development in large part depended on his analysis of the peasantry and peasant identity. So you see how he's getting around the ethnic stuff, right? He's looking at how people get it or don't get it. And that's where that's really, from what I'm understanding, that's really the center of the way he proceeds, right? That's really the center of which he proceeds. The analysis of rural classes in Guinea begins and ends with the recognition that it is impossible to distinguish social groups politically unless one can differentiate them in accordance with various kinship ties that enter into the identity of the different ethnic communities of which the social groups are a part. Cabral's analysis here is trying to come to terms with the distinction between what John Lonsdale, in 1994, would come to call the characteristics of political tribalism and moral ethnicity, where the social construction of ethnicity has an internal and external constitution. The latter, moral ethnicity, was formed out of the ideological and political arenas within which ethnic identity is developed through bargaining over the authority within the boundaries of political community. These internal struggles over identity were also linked to and restrained by a normative realm of reciprocity and social rights and obligations, a moral economy of the rights of access to resources and prosperity. Together, they would define the normative foundations of both the cohesiveness of or conflict within a given community. The external facet of ethnicity, political tribalism, inextricably linked to moral ethnicity, did not involve a pursuit of a normative moral identification. It emerged rather out of colonialism's varying effects on different African communities and would be occupied with collectively mobilizing and organizing the political community. Such tribalism went beyond the boundaries of communities delimited by moral ethnicity, whether challenging or collaborating with the colonial state, and thereafter challenging the interests of contesting ethnicities who also seek access to state patronage and political control. All right, so just to read that last sentence again, I think it's important. Such tribalism went beyond the boundaries of communities delimited by moral ethnicity, whether challenging or collaborating with the colonial state, and thereafter challenging the interests of contesting ethnicities who also seek access to state patronage and political power. Among certain ethnic groups, particularly between the so-called horizontal state societies of some of the Muslim groups, such as the Fulas, for instance, it was obvious that great power was wielded by certain village chiefs. Under colonialism, some of these chiefs would become chiefs de posta, serving as tax collectors for the colonial state. Imagine that, huh? Outside of these Islamized groups, under colonialism, most of these chiefs were not the traditional village elders or homines grandes who continued to retain much respect within their communities. Many chiefs as administrators have become native police, and many, as elsewhere in Africa, were in fact imposed on peoples from outside of their own ethnic group. This regime of native administration is what Mamdani in 1996 has recently called the modus operandi of colonial rule, a rural despotism, which was a pivot of ethnic consolidation under colonialism, an attempt by the colonial authorities to cosmeticize customary justice that was really administrative justice. Mamdani is worth citing in full because his depiction of the dual process, the contradictory moment of the rural dimension of political, ethnic, and colonial power, which is quintessentially Cabral-like. Quote, ethnicity, in other words, was never just about identity. Its two contradictory moments involve both social control and social emancipation. This is why it makes sense neither just to embrace ethnicity uncritically, nor simply to reject it one-sidedly. Everywhere, the local apparatus of the colonial state was organized either ethnically or on a religious basis. Right? So you see, like when we talk about Nigeria, we see a continuation of this. Right? Yet it is also true that it is difficult to recall a single major peasant uprising during the colonial period that has not been either ethnic or religious in inspiration. This is so for a simple but basic reason. The anti-colonial struggle was above all a struggle against the hierarchy of the local state, the tribally organized native authority. This is why everywhere, although the cadres of the nationalist movement were recruited mainly from urban areas, the movement gained depth the more it was anchored in the struggle of the peasantry against the array of native authorities that shackled it. After independence, however, there was a dramatic shift in the political focus of the nationalist leadership, from the local to the central state apparatus, from the decolonization of local state apparatuses to a dual preoccupation, deracializing civil society in the towns and restructuring unequal international relations. Cabral was quick to add though, that the semi-feudal or strongly hierarchical, vertical, or stateless group patrimonial social systems could not be explained simply by Portuguese colonialism. The character of these ethnic groupings and political organizations predated colonialism, although he never actually developed extensively in what ways they did. Moreover, there was at least one non-Muslim or so-called animist group, the Manjakas, which showed social relations characterized by a patrimonialism similar to the Islamized groups. This patrimonialism consisted on the one hand of lineage chiefs, heads of extended families or villages whose ancestry, according to custom, could be directly linked to the spiritual authorities. And on the other hand, it consisted of their dependents and exploited peasantry who, with few rights, had to fulfill certain work obligations to the spiritual authorities in order to have some access to the land. You see, that's Portuguese colonialism had sought out these groups because their social practices dovetail with colonial administrative goals. Let's read that again. Portuguese colonialism had sought out these groups because their social practices dovetailed with colonial administrative goals. In contrast, other vertical animist communities or ethnic groups, such as the Balantes and certain Mandingas, had very little social stratification, nor the nascent state organization characteristic of the patrimonial or semi-feudal systems. They were instead segmented societies organized in and around age, grades, and village and lineage loyalties, and of course gender. Such divergent traditions, along with diverse economic circumstances, would, despite a similar level of the material resources, define different ethnicities and cultures, with variable consequences in a variety of areas. For instance, Chabal and others have suggested that Cabral's reasons for believing why groups like the Balantes supported the struggle were at best incomplete. One reason for the Balantes' seeming enthusiasm for the cause was their relatively more egalitarian, decentralized system of social organization. However, perhaps more important was the fact that the Balantes were more urbanized than other peoples and have confronted more transparent exploitation through the system of taxation, economic grievance, and repression in the towns, as well as the denigrations of colonial racism. This brings us to a section called Women's Participation, a perplexing issue. Let me check in with the chat room. In the chat room, Rasta says to Derica Cooper Photography, we cannot break it as long as we are defining on their terms, like speaking in their language. But I get Mr. Fuller. I think only black people have to unite, and we have to wave the North African fair-skinned Arabs out because they won't compromise. They actually are proud to not be part of Africa, but want to be part of the fair-skinned people. So, two things that was said there will get the pro-black perspective going if you give them a chance about Neely Fuller. Check out this episode, the Pro-Black Perspective episode on about Neely Fuller. And the next thing will get KW Dawn 7 going, as we had a discussion in the chat room a couple episodes back about what do we do with the Arabs in North Africa. When the Pro-Black Perspective and I had the crossover show where we discussed the East African Federation, you know, it came up that the focus for Africans, black Africans, might be to focus on sub-Saharan Africa and kind of ignore the North, you know, at least initially. But ultimately, I do agree with Rasta and KW-7 that you got to get the Arabs up out of there too. But you got to make baby steps. You gotta complete the first set of steps before you can jump into the rest, right? Let's continue. The woman's participation, a perplexing issue. The significantly different patterns of social and economic life would also suggest future practices with respect to both the mobilization of ethnicities as members of classes of peasantry, as well as the perplexing practical issue of women's emancipation. There was also the problem of how to address the traditional leaders within the rural areas, or whether their customary place as intellectuals in society would accord them a different status within the changing distribution of land, labor, and productive tasks in their various communities. As Luke has suggested, quote, new forms of human interaction and individual identity models break down the oppressive social customs involving young, old, male, female, intra-family, extra-family, or inter-village relations in colonial society. For example, women were treated as property among some Muslim communities, being married and requisitioned as early as 12, with polygamy being widespread. And these practices are considered next to the unwillingness of Muslim men to send their women to schools for even the rudimentary skills and literacy set up by the party in some of the liberated areas. The circle of oppression was closed. Among the Balantes, the oppression of women was less, despite relatively earlier marriages, polygamy, and patrilineal descent, because women were allowed to keep what they produced. Women were allowed to keep what they produced, right? Just highlighting here, bear with me. Again, then, we see how depicting ethnicity was linked to questions of power over resources, not least of all women, and the degree of autonomy they would have both within the household and in the so-called public realm. Cabral's approach to practice here, as on many other matters, was cautious and pragmatic, and linked to the specificity of the ethnic groups whom he was addressing at any given point in time. There were no instant formulas for women's emancipation from the various forms of oppression that they endured. For instance, their continuing burden of household duties, including childcare, on top of productive and subsistence work. Women accepted into the party were not allowed to bear arms during the War of Liberation, although they did have arms within village committees. They were indeed, in Stephanie Erdang's phrase, fighting two colonialisms. Nevertheless, there were, as Erdang has also pointed out, a variety of implicit principles and explicit ground rules that both Cabral and the PAIGC laid down, such as no polygamy amongst party members and a commitment to achieving equal status for women. This commitment may not sound like much, but in historical context, it allowed many of the younger women a political social space hitherto unthinkable, so much so that there is little wonder why women were amongst the earliest and most enthusiastic supporters of the PAIGC. Again, concrete knowledge of extensive variation in practices within given ethnic groups towards women lent to adjusting to, although never being accommodating with, crude patriarchy. Yeah, that's how you use the data, right? To quote Tone Talks there, that's how you use the data. We got the data. Gender roles had begun to change, but there was clearly no erosion of gender power. It was fundamentally important not to assume gender roles, nor their predetermined outcome in everyday practice, even if the long-term goal was one of beyond the obvious one of autonomy. Received attitudes towards women were one of the many aspects of peasant ethnic cultures that Cabral and the PAIGC also had to alter in a principled way, but cautiously and realistically too. There was a balance to be kept between forging commitments and building a constituency, and between instilling trust and confidence, while not abrogating longer-term goals and a fidelity to principles. The balance entailed, amongst many other things, addressing the needs of those whom they wanted on side. It would also mean understanding how these various social groups fitted into a wider network of patronage and dependence, and ensuring that where they fitted would not unduly upset the ultimate purpose of laying the groundwork for the post-colonial state and society. Take, for example, the itinerant traders and village craftsmen, the Diulas. They are a traditional ethnic middlemen or long-distance trading class found across the breadth of the Guineas, Senegal, Mali, and Ivory Coast. And the modern Diulas are Muslim, Mandingo-speaking traders who arose during colonialism. Depending on which commodity they were associated with, or in fact, how close they were to the commodity chain of Portuguese colonialism, could be one of the conduits for either support for or resistance to national independence, or through their links to the local chiefs they post to, self-interested agents of repression. Yet by their very nature, they could also be a means of communication, one of their traditionally historical roles between communities, part of a network for spreading information about the goals of independence, aware of their political fickleness, and of the Diulas' concern, like all traders, with buying cheap and selling dear. Cabral was under no delusion that they constituted a disinterested network of distribution and communication. He nevertheless asserted their possible utility for the liberation struggle and ultimately for the building of after independence. You see, he is really brilliant what he did here, right? In this, Cabral once again shows remarkable pragmatism and a lack of dogmatism with regard to ethnic disposition and economic interests, suggesting both the fluidity of ethnic relations and the mutuality involved in achieving certain goals of self-interest. That's the word right there. Right? Fluidity of ethnic relations and the mutuality involved in achieving certain goals of self-interest. Right? However seemingly naive, exchange on the one hand, economic welfare on the other. Bring us to a section called Mobilizing Pluriethnic Communities. Mobilizing Pluriethnic Communities. I see we have some activity in the chat room, but I'll get through this section and then I'll address what's going on in the chat room. Cabral's social analysis here then was no academic exercise in social anthropology, but was concerned with the practical problems of understanding how class and ethnic alliances throughout rural and urban Guinea might be formed. These coalitions were meant to cut across the spatial dimension of country and town, tribal, religion, and gender. And they constituted the chief problem in attempting to mobilize various groups in Guinea. These coalitions were meant to cut across the spatial dimension of country and town, tribal, religion, and gender, which is our major problems on the continent. They constituted the chief problem in attempting to mobilize various groups in Guinea. And that's, if you're right now organizing people, especially on the continent, but wherever you are, if you're organizing people, this is the thing you have to address right here. Right? You have to cut across, country and town, tribe, religion, gender, and just get to, the understanding that you need these alliances, right, to build a nation or to mobilize, right? For instance, it had been assumed that the leaders of the Fulas and the Manjakas, the last of the major ethnic groups in Guinea to fight against the Portuguese during colonization, would readily join the liberation struggle and lead all their peasantry to mobilize and support the struggle. Such assumptions were made without giving due consideration to the fact of accommodation and the interests of the ruling groups within the communities, many of whom saw the move towards a more egalitarian form of government entailing a threat to their control over their dependents. If we are to believe the PAIGC reports and Cabral himself. In addition, it didn't give sufficient weight to the histories of groups of peoples, their leadership, or the people within the communities themselves, wishing to remain relatively autonomous from centralized power outside their community because of their long history of independence, and also because the role that religion played in their lives and the subjects within these communities. This was an area that Cabral appears to have been remiss in his understanding of the historical sociology of the peoples, despite his knowledge of their social relations. Furthermore, besides the tightness of kinship ties between ruler and ruled within certain societies, popular mobilization was impeded by the absence of land hunger and of large landless proletariat, and the veiled forms of exploitation that the peasantry as a whole suffered. The situation of Guinea contrasted with that of other Portuguese colonies and settler colonialism in general, where in many ways the raison d'etre for popular revolt. This contrast meant finding a language appropriate to the circumstances, one that could address the peasantry and mobilize it to support the independence struggle. Speaking of colonialism, much less the rhetoric of imperialism, was therefore insufficient for peasant comprehension. Cabral used a technique that he imparted to other party members to query peasants so as to draw out peasant grievances through concrete questions and examples from their own experience. Quote, why are you going to fight? What are you? What is your father? What does your father do up to now? What is the situation? Did you pay taxes? Did your father pay taxes? What have you seen from these taxes? How much did you get from your groundnuts? Have you thought how much you will earn from your groundnuts? How much sweat has it cost your family? Which of you has been imprisoned? You're going to work on road building. Who gives you the tools? You bring the tools. Who provides your meals? But who walks on the road? Who has a car? And your daughter who was raped. Are you happy about that? Cabral in 1969. These down-to-earth questions derive from what is in fact an extended and sophisticated heuristic method, the purpose of which is to draw out the resistance to the cultural hegemony that imposed a limited view of the world. It intended to show that the seeds to resistance are within a people's own understanding of their confrontation with the alien state and those who impose the terms of economic activity and enforce foreign dominance. Cabral urged the peasantry to think about the reasons for participation in the independence struggle and establish grounds for consensus participation in post-colonial construction. In short, Cabral roots the mobilization of the peasantry in its own economic and social welfare, indeed its own self-interest, but in so doing, Cabral was always ethnically specific and by extension culturally and socially opposite. What, for example, would be the implication of the non-Islamized ethnic groups having a relatively egalitarian pattern in the distribution of land? The land is collectively owned, even though the instruments of production and the product of labor were distributed individually. Then the relatively equal allocation between dependents would hardly induce the head of the household to be sympathetic to change. Cabral saw the antithesis between collective ownership of land and the familial possession of tools and produce as one of the major contradictions in Guinean society. Although he did not elaborate on why this contradiction should be so central, one must assume that he was pointing out a problem to be resolved politically. Tension between collective ownership of land and household or individual possession. The latter was not so much a tension between use rights and inheritance rights, but rather a possible hindrance to the indefinite aims of collective agriculture that are most definitely based upon forms of collective identity, which Cabral must have known could not be possibly applied across the board, irrespective of identity. There is, one suspects, an implicit assumption of the possibility of even narrow selfish concerns inherent in individualistic agricultural production, as opposed to the reciprocity of collective or communal agricultural practices, which socialists, including Cabral, have been conventionally enamored of. If Cabral and the PAIGC did see it as a problem, they did not express it. Respect for individual household production and distribution became embedded in the party's program. A model of egalitarian collectivism was emphasized by Cabral in the programmatic documents of the PAIGC, where, quote, cooperative exploitation on the basis of free consent will cover the land and agricultural production, the production of goods and artisan articles, end of quote. Market socialism embodying ethnic pluralism, question mark, we do not know, but Cabral certainly believed in both administrative and economic decentralization that was built upon the agronomic farming practices and the extant property systems of the given communities. You know, that this last section led me to think of a question. There's a quote by Bill Cosby that says, if you want to succeed, the worst thing you can do is try to please everyone, right? I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said. Do you think Cabral, in his analysis, do you think one of the issues with his analyses is that he would have been trying too hard to appease everyone? And do you think that would have been, ultimately a goal stopper? Do you think ultimately that'll be a goal stopper? You guys post your answer in the chat and I will read it live on the air. Thus, it was also important to emphasize those aspects of the struggle which Cabral saw as ultimately determining the outcome of society that he and the party wanted to create. Of particular importance were two combined aspects of mobilization. What Lars Rudbeck in 1974 and 1992 has called the intransitive and transitive forms of mobilization, to bring the peasantry into matters affecting it. Intransitive mobilization refers to an understanding by the people of the various social and economic circumstances in which they find themselves. Transitive mobilization refers specifically to those party initiatives on matters of policy and organization. Okay. Central to both forms of mobilization is the emphasis on the importance of participation. Participation, being both a goal and a means of achieving goals, was central to Cabral's project of bringing about an institutionally sound, democratic, post-colonial society and state. He believed that the forms of embryonic participatory networks existing within some ethnic groups could be a good place to begin organizing the peasantry. Mass participation would be the means through which the organizational form of independence would take place in the shape of a decentralized decision-making process focused upon the needs of the peasantry. Cabral states, Cabral states, our new administration will be strictly without those chains of command familiar in colonial times, governors of provinces and so on. Above all, we want to decentralize as much as possible. That is one reason why we are inclined to think that Bissau will not continue to be our capital in an administrative sense. In fact, we're against the whole idea of a capital. Why shouldn't ministries be dispersed? Why should we saddle ourselves with the paraphernalia of a presidential palace? A concentration of ministries, the clear signs of an emergent elite, which can soon become a privileged group. I can't copy that. That's a good quote. Along with politically decentralized administration, Cabral also emphasized that a diversified and more productive agriculture would be the first priority. Cabral knew the needs of a changing political regime under the duress of economic survival and the pressure of economic development. Cabral's policy statements and party programs recognized the need to transform subsistence into surplus farming. It also recognized that such a transformation can only be worth anything democratically if it were under popular collective control. There was the creation of village committees that gave ordinary peasants some sense of empowerment through local decision making. The development of new schools, giving people the expanding horizons that literacy creates, and the development of a rudimentary but extensive healthcare system, right? The gains in political and social reorganization and cultural vitality were not matched in the economic field, whether during the independence struggle and certainly not after independence in 1974, and which laid the foundation for the coup in 1980, and much of the devastation politically and economically to the country thereafter only adds to the poignancy of Cabral's realization of its fundamental importance. There was finally the problem of tribalism. Normatively, Cabral's concern with tribalism or the politically divisive aspects of ethnicity, as with his concern with racism, was in fact typical of his broadly humanistic outlook, and his concern with looking beyond the racial and or ethnic dimensions of nationalism to the founding of a new state and society. Like Fanon, Cabral consistently refused to allow people to view exploitation in the reduced state of a them and us, or black-white antinomy. Domestic exploitation, as with class or ethnic exploitation, had to be addressed too. It was also the hindrance to the reintegration and redefining of self that came with the moral instrumental assertions of nationalism. There could be no movement towards an understanding of the structure of domination and exploitation if the obvious was masked. Africans also partook in the exploitation of others' labor and will continue to do so in the absence of the appropriate political and institutional checks upon them. Well, some people will say, you're cooning, right? If you said something like that, but we gotta face facts, right? Africans also partook in the exploitation of others' labor and will continue to do so in the absence of the appropriate political and institutional checks upon them. Cabral considered tribalism to be a minor contradiction within the Ghanaian context. However, in that it had not played any considerable part in the independence struggle. Nevertheless, he also believed that tribalism had become one of the more reactionary and politically exploitative dimensions of community, fostered by what he believed to be the political ambition of unscrupulous political leaders elsewhere in Africa to maintain a political power base at the expense of national well-being. Right? So that also sheds good light on this tribal thing too. There are those people who stoke the fire of tribalism, right, for their political wants. And they do that in exchange for the national, and I dare say international, well-being of Africans in the diaspora. If Cabral would have understood the distinction between the negotiated political reconfiguration of political tribalism, using identity to achieve division between communities and to make personal and political capital from it, ethical ethnicity, right? The quote-unquote ethical ethnicity, a commitment to values that sustain a self of identity and community. He would have done so especially in light of the incomprehension of many traditional chiefs and elders, many of whom, even when they recognized the ability of independence from the Portuguese, could not get used to the corrosive effects of national liberation upon existing patterns of social order and respect within the traditional communities. For instance, elders often no longer had control over younger members of the village, some of whom who had become directors of the Podo Popular and Tabancas or village committees, among other institutions within the emergent political communities organized by the party. Yeah, and a lot of people don't want to give up what they have, right? A lot of elders or olders don't like to give up what they've got, right? Which also causes problems. Brings us to a section called Towards a Participatory Democratic Post-Colonial State. Before I read it, let me check in with the chat room. In the chat room, we have Erzuliism in the room. And Erzuliism asks a question, does open revolution work? Does open revolution work? Rasta asks a question, what is that? I thought the revolution will not be televised. LOL. Kevin Kerr asks how Erzuliism is doing. Erzuliism says, it seems to me all these revolutions are televised. All right? All these revolutions are televised. Erzuliism also says, all is trying to educate the colonial powers about our right to be free and self-governing is nauseating. I agree. At this point, you know, we really don't need to be trying to talk to these folks anyway. We need to be making our own power moves. Dorico Cooper Photography says, you're on point, Rasta. Dorico Cooper Photography says, what's up, Erzuliism? He also says it is televised, but they are controlling the narrative. Rasta says, right, damn it. Dorico Cooper Photography says they know better than we do and continue to try to confuse us with these Hollywood movies. I just did something, messed me up just now. Hold on. Rasta says our parents should have told and educate us on all these issues Black people were and are still facing to this very day, but they failed. But I don't blame them because they're equally deceived as we are, even more so than we are. LOL. The pro-black perspective is still around. Pro-black perspective says, Cabral's questions were good. I really need to study him closer. Started reading him on a podcast, but I never finished. Yeah, those questions were, I mean, that's the questions. So, like, the pro-black perspective was, at one point had this think tank, and I guess it was like the beginnings of like an organization, right? And you know, when the brainstorming was going on, one of the things I said was, you know, you got to be able to present the benefits, and he added, you also have to present the punishments, right? Which is something Derico Cooper kind of mentioned earlier. And along those lines of that discussion that we had, I think you could insert Cabral's questions. Cabral's questions are asking you straight up, like, what is this to you? If someone rapes your daughter, what is it to you? What are you about to do about it? Right? So he's kind of asking questions that bring about the reward as well as the punishment of not being aligned. Derico Cooper Photography says, I feel you. It's like we are stuck in the 1960s. I thought it was 2021. Rasta said, exactly. It is like we are repeating what our grandparents and parents went through since they failed to educate us from the very beginning. Derico Cooper says, the colonization of music has stunted our growth in many ways. Rasta asks, what do you mean with music? Like hip-hop or just in general? Derico Cooper says, generally speaking, a lot of the music today has about as much substance as a bag of hot Cheetos and a Coke compared to the music of the 60s. It's more like a full course home cooked meal. You know, as you mentioned that, what's that, there's a Marvin Gaye album that basically breaks down everything you need to know, you know, from like the 1900s to like the 1970s, right? Derico Cooper Photography says there is still plenty of good music being produced today, but it's not mainstream. Shout out to Rock. You know, Rock, when I used to do music, I used to perform in places where she was, and she dropped an album recently. I think she had a kid recently too, which is funny. Check out the Off the Topic page on Discord. Yeah, so again, Derico Cooper Photography has posted a lot of information on the Off Topic channel on the Discord. If you guys need the Discord, again, if you haven't joined already, here's the link. Join the Discord. You can see some of the stuff that Derico Cooper Photography has been posting. I'm gonna try get into it more this coming week, as it is spring break and I have a little bit of time. Let me just finish off these comments here. Rasta says those are stuck in the past. Derico Cooper Photography smiles or laughs at what he says. The link for the Discord. I'm trying to open the Discord behind the scenes. It's taking a while to open. Seems like when I'm on here, Discord is kind of slow. Oh, I posted something else before. Okay, so here's the link. Sorry about that. All right, so to continue, let's finish off this paper strong. Towards a participatory, democratic, post-colonial state. These institutions, from village courts to primary and secondary schools, and from the introduction of medical personnel to the development of village cooperatives, as well as the constant process of cadres encouraging self-criticism in the face of the needs and demands of the peasantry, were all seen as necessary investments in social and human capital given the absence of development. Self-criticism, a standard form of ideological control for communist regimes at the time, was seen by Cabral as a means to obtain political honesty among the leadership and a way of ensuring a bond between the leadership and the people. In so doing, leadership would exemplify a principle of radical democracy. Cabral hoped that the practice of radical revolutionary decentralized democracy, coupled with the administrative and symbolic capital of the party, might provide some political stability and an extension of the value of participation and democracy for what was in effect the emergent post-colonial state. It is for this reason that Cabral saw no conflict between a unitary party at the national level and participatory institutions at the village level. Okay. Since peasant participation served as a pedagogical function, advising the people as to the meaning and operational significance of participation and citizenship. Actually, the creation of these institutions was one of the major achievements of Cabral and the pre-independence PAIGC. That the political and economic reconstruction would collapse a few years after Cabral's death is perhaps testimony to their institutional weakness, whatever their normative status. However, this political and economic reorganization was developed to ensure that, among other things, communities did not like narrow tribalism, degenerate into a divisive and de-establishing force, undermining the foundations for the post-colonial state and society. Cabral believed that to invest too much power or faith in the traditional chiefs, or even in some of the more sympathetic elders, could be risky. That's an interesting statement. That's an interesting statement. I mean, that must have made him unpopular, right? To say, you know, we ain't putting too much power or faith in these traditional chiefs, right? Or in even some of the more sympathetic elders. Wow. Whatever their orientation, supportive or adversarial, they had no right to rule independently of what they would contribute to the people's welfare. And even given the fact that, as Cabral put it, the elders were the historical intellectuals of the societies of Guinea, they were the natural competitors with the party for ideological leadership. The elders' function as intellectuals was inseparable from their function of control or domination. Do you think we as a group still have that problem where we're competing with the elders too much? Right? They represented the past that could represent the future, but under the terms of participatory democracy. If the traditional leadership were able to disassociate their intellectual role from traditional forms of hegemony, if they were able to adapt to the new circumstances, then they could contribute to the task of political leadership. Otherwise, simply to give elders and chiefs leadership roles, as elsewhere in Africa, would be to undemocratically mortgage the future. If old heads aren't getting up to speed with what's going on with the changes, right? You got to put them to the side. Now, if they're keeping up and they're progressing or being progressive, right, they can be considered. Cabral's attempt to limit the role of traditional chiefs was simultaneously an attempt to deal with the issue and meaning of citizenship in the modern world, as well as to confront patriarchy. The values contained within given communities, frequently designated as tradition, but always contestable in fact and practice, often limited mobility in thought and in social and political action, regularly through social control of the family by elders. Modern forms of participation, however, mean mobility, suggesting some breakdown of historically given ties that restrict access to ways of life chosen through new forms of decision making and participation, forms of participation that would also undermine the need for competition that often underlie ethnic politics. I like that. There was a need then for making people see the benefits of their own participation in broader political life, for making them see what possibilities open up for them through participation. Cabral's stress on unity coupled with participation recognized the need for national integration and a common sense of belonging to the nation among the various people in the emergent states. This is what we talked about at the beginning of the year on the show when we had this open discussion on unity, right? But essentially, like KW7 said in the last episode, get rid of the goofy stuff, religion and tribalism and all that stuff. Just understand that we're all citizens, right? Make sure that everyone participates, right? Make sure everyone understands the benefits of participating, right? And you will be fine, right? National integration. Again, that doesn't mean to disrespect and say death to, tribes with, all their history, but it does mean put that to the side. Let's understand that we're all participants here, right? Let's integrate the nation and let's get on with the work. All right? Ronald Chilcote, over 30 years ago in 1968, the hell is this? Had referred to Cabral's strategy as, quote, developmental nationalism, the attempt to create institutions through which groups and individuals within the fragmented civil society can identify with and work towards. National integration would require a gradual overcoming of the local horizons within peasant and more broadly Ghanaian life. The barriers to national unity include class and ethnic conflict, and the lack of organizational, administrative, and extended economic resources to resolve conflict. Let me read that again. The barriers to national unity include class and ethnic conflict, and the lack of organizational, administrative, and extended economic resources to resolve conflict. Faced with these barriers, Cabral called for the consolidation of the nation class, a term suggesting unity. The concept of nation class would serve to break down the psychological as well as geographical barriers of peasant ethnic parochialism. It would also serve to combat the colonial economic interests and domination, but also the self-serving petty bourgeoisie that might consolidate power for themselves. Yet to whatever degree Cabral believed that theoretical enlightenment should come from outside, and however much he may have thought that certain traditional assumptions and institutions needed at least to be modified, his intention was not to dissolve the community ties that characterize the different cultures among the peoples of Guinea. Contrary to the claims of Judson Lyon, one of the few people to engage in some detailed analysis of Cabral's writings on ethnicity, Cabral did not embrace nationalism because he lacked an ethnic group with which to identify. That's an interesting statement. That's something to look up. So Cabral wasn't from a particular ethnic group. That's interesting. That is, his espousal of Marxism and nationalism cannot be explained from his own lack of roots in an ethnic identity. Lyon's explanation of Cabral's alleged lack of identity has obscured the reason for Cabral's insistence on the need for unity. It has failed to mention the very insecure social foundations of many emerging nation states and has omitted any reference to Cabral's insistence on the need not to homogenize different ethnic groups and their culture, right? Which is the point I've been trying to make. We're not trying to flatten ethnicity, but we are trying to promote an integration that leads to a nation. Indeed, as we have constantly emphasized, Cabral's regard for those cultural accords with the principle of decentralization, he went to great pains to tell party activists to be aware of major cultural differences among different ethnic groups, not just along the various social axes of class, power, and inequality, but also in the ways in which these axes often converge in shared identities, derived from a shared lived experience. Yet, and perhaps most fundamentally, what Cabral knew more than most is that meaning and significance of nationalism and the cohesion of the post-colonial state, the tolerance between communities are all linked to socio-economic improvement. This brings us to Cabral's theoretical contribution. I'm going to take one last quick station ID, and I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Also, make sure to check out the Queen's Council podcast as well. So, Cabral's theoretical contribution. We asserted at the beginning that unity and struggle in the face of the many forms of difference are the central themes in Cabral's work. The centrality lies in the search to find institutions consonant to the realities of social classes, ethnic groups, cultures, and ideas that could be used in socialist construction under the different and difficult circumstances of economic backwardness in the modern world and under the fracturing and oppressing legacy of an equally backward colonialism. These were the weaknesses against which the people and the party had to be constantly struggling, and which seem poignantly opposite in today's Guinea-Bissau, riven as it was until recently by civil war, where state-peasant relations are characterized by an antagonism between producers and the party, and where the political and economic structures continue to discriminate against the peasant majority. Production and class leadership of a united revolutionary peasantry by the PAIGC were to be the links through which any overcoming of this legacy would be established. It was hoped that an extended production and distribution network would be tangible evidence of the benefits resulting from the involvement in the liberation struggle. The other side of increasing well-being would be political participation. The people seeing themselves contributing to an emerging nation and their own well-being. Cabral adumbrated a model of development that used familiar existing institutions to develop people's consciousness and an awareness of their power to make their own history, but one that amended existing institutions and transferred popular culture to facilitate the development of a new nation state. And that right there sums up, I believe, the question I was asked in the last episode of the show. I forgot. I think it was Omalone 11 who asked it. How was Cabral able to do the work that he did in Guinea-Bissau and overcome the ethnic issue. And I think that right there sums it up. Right? Self-consciousness, awareness of their power, awareness of their power to make their own history, but also by creating institutions, by changing existing institutions, right, to facilitate the development of a new nation state. That sums it up. That's the importance of consciousness, period. Right? Cabral had no illusions about what it means to engage the people or about the numerous unresolved questions concerning how to achieve development within a nation state, let alone now passé goal of socialism in a country such as Guinea-Bissau. He had the clarity of purpose, the cultural sensitivity, and the analytical acumen to realize that one must start from people's past in order to make their future. Nothing but a word right there. One must start with what might appear to be perhaps meager resources of a peasant past, of a particular heritage or productive culture, and the social relations of particular ethnic groups in order to forge a future that is distinctively their very variegated own. Despite his developmentalism, despite his sometimes urban and typically modernist nationalist hostility to the hierarchies of traditional rule, Cabral's eye for the particular always led him back to what most of the foundation for a viable political community, recognizing the centrality of people's well-being and the deprivation in the constant shaping and reshaping of their identities and difference. Within the context of Africa's recurrent economic crisis, this once again may seem like an obvious truism, but it is one that before Cabral few had viewed, and there have been few that have said it so well since. Cabral was, despite it, indeed because of his nationalistic project, an ethnic pluralist for whom people's identities mattered. Cabral was, despite, indeed because of it, his nationalist project, ethnic pluralists for whom people's identities mattered. Yet he also knew they were contestable. Cabral had come to a critique of essentialist notions of cultural identity and ethnicity. Although Cabral's theoretical contributions are drawn out from a particular methodological stance and are located empirically in his focus on Guinea-Bissau and the Cabo Verde Islands, he raises some fundamental questions about social science and about field research, which remain at the heart of a kind of engaged research, which in turn prevail at the heart of power relations in Africa. Knowledge in the service of liberation. He could never complete, but he certainly contributes to the debate about the significance, but also the conceptual elaboration of the context for how we categorize ethnicity in Africa. Of particular importance is his emphasis upon production in the environment of ethnic differentiation and class formation. It's understanding that ethnicity cannot be separated from class, and conversely, class cannot be separated from that ethnicity. Equally consequential is his acknowledgement of symbolic power within communities, which can sustain the relationship between ethnicity and community and the classes within them. In Cabral, we can identify a serviceable lineage to an African political and social thought rarely drawn upon despite the moral force of his personality, and in so many ways still useful to broadening and analyzing a problem so central to African political theory and practice. Like all nationalists, Cabral was a normative theorist practitioner. He thought about how values guided ends. He wanted a theory as much as moral calculus that would be appropriate to independence and thereafter. And in this instance, in attempting to sort out the relationship between politics and cultural values, he essentially examines and challenges the assumption that attitudes, as ethnic consciousness, directly determine political practices outside of the context of production relations. What Cabral called for, and which is now standard for any satisfactory political science, is good historical and ethnographic accounts of politics that view culture as resources through its symbols and language are adopted instrumentally to achieve cultural and political ends. One of those points of contact is the intersection of interest with various forms of both symbolic and material power. We might disagree with Tamarkin, 1996, that ethnicity is the most effective socio-political agent in African politics and cannot be suppressed. We cannot, however, disagree that its role needs to be reassessed, or that in of itself, ethno-cultural identity is intrinsically antagonistic to the broad community of the nation space. In addition, we can agree that a debate should indeed be had about the relationship between different ethnic value systems, and that an arena should be provided in which a moral debate is engaged concerning the appropriate relations between groups in society. The post-colonial state lacks legitimacy, in part because of its inability to manage ethnic relations, and so it lacks legitimacy for its inability to create, provide, and redistribute wealth amongst its various peoples. When the necessary relations between political stability and economic well-being is considered a truism, but when equally the formation of ethnic politics is rarely seen through the prism of culture, class, and labor, it might be time to begin looking afresh at these relationships. Cabral provided us with a beginning which I believe ought to be pursued and developed. Do you agree, listeners, that Cabral provides us with a beginning? That Cabral is on to something here, right? As you answer that, let me read some comments in the chat room. Rasta says, but they making them humble. So that's the thing. And I had this conversation with some students recently who pissed me off. Historically, you go back to ancient Kemet, Africa, right? It's where the Greeks and the Romans get their philosophy from. The understanding was that when you were dealing with an elder who usually was a teacher, or a master teacher at that, for you to be able to learn sufficiently, you have to humble yourself, right? But the elder or the master teacher also had to be humbled in that he or she, usually he, can make a mistake too. And so, while the elders do have the wisdom, and while the youth need to humble themselves to to the elder and the wisdom that they have, the knowledge that they have, right? Because elders don't just have information. Youth may have information, but elders have information and knowledge. They've actually interacted with the information. At the same time, elders or teachers need to recognize that they can stumble too. They need to also recognize, and usually the student teaches them this, that there's different ways things can be done. That's how we improve upon processes, right? The youth come along, they learn from the elders, and then they see it in their own way, and they sometimes find a way to change, right? To change the processes, to streamline it, for example. So elders also have to be humble that the youth can learn from them and might improve upon processes. And I think that's what Cabral was really pushing for. Right? If you're an elder who's moving with the times and engaging with the youth and what the youth are talking about and the youth ideas, if you're engaging with that and you're bringing wisdom, that's fine. Then you can still have some political influence. But if you're set in your elder ways and you're not engaging with the youth, you're not humbling yourself to realize, hey, the youth are onto something here, right? Cabral and them didn't want to deal with that. Right? Kevin Care 42 says it's time for the elders to pass the baton to the new generation. New ideas, new way of thinking, new perspective. Sitting water becomes stagnant. That's the thing. If you're an elder who can interact with the youth, can understand where they're coming from, and you provide that elder guidance, I think the elders are very useful in that way. Right? But if you're just stuck in those old ways like Kevin Care is talking about and Rasta and stuff like that, if you're just stuck in those old ways and you're not changing off of it, not realizing that the world changes every day, right? Then you're no use to us. Yep. Derico Cooper Photography says, yep, and we can get the cryptocurrency game up. When it's Black Excellence says when it's only one leader, it becomes despotic, right? That's another thing that I gotta give Cabral credit for, right? Let's get rid of all this centralized bullshit, right? Let's spread this out. Let's really make it, a democratic type of nation, right? Kevin Care 42, NYC Beauty says to Kevin Care 42, yes, fresh leadership for a new generation. The elders have brought us this far. They need to rest, and the new generation must take the reins. Derico Cooper Photography says to NYC Beauties, you're on point. Azuliism says, I feel that there is an egotistical aspect of an open revolution. And at the end, we all get found out. Open revolution is suicidal to the leader and the movement. There's truth to what Azuliism is saying. Open revolution is openly waging war. And it will be foolish for the party that you've waged war on to not wage war back on you. Right? The problem is mobilizing without being somewhat open is always that fine line that we have a problem with. How do you get the people to mobilize? Like Marcus Garvey, right? Marcus Garvey had to be known by the British, right? From his days in Jamaica. And when he came to America and got all these people, millions of people mobilized, the British had to tell America, keep your eye on this guy. In fact, get him out of it. Right? That's what you call open revolution. And so it's hard to really organize and mobilize organizations and not be open. In my opinion. NYC Beauty says, quote from the Black National Anthem, sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Absolutely. Rasta says, beautiful. Azuliism says, a righteous dictator is better than the democratic, spineless, weak leaders of today. Whew, that's a heavy one there, Azuliism. How many righteous dictators have we seen? Right? Kevin Care 42 says to Azuliism, yep, no more of these damn spineless yes man suck up puppets. Also shiftless. Kevin K42 says, the second concerning the way the seeker has need of a master to guide him and lift him up when he falls, to lead him back to the right way when he strays. Ancient Egyptian proverb. When the governing class isn't chosen for quality, it is chosen for material wealth. This always means decadence, the lowest stage a society can reach. Ancient Egyptian proverb. Kevin Cares on a roll. He says, if you defy an enemy by doubting his courage, you double it. Exactly. Also ancient Egyptian proverb. Kevin Cares says, if you would know yourself, take yourself as starting point and go back to its source. Your beginning will disclose your end. Peace is the fruit of activity, not of sleep. Right? Ancient Egyptian proverb. So, Dorico Cooper Photography says there is a difference between elders and olders. Yeah, absolutely. Olders are the ones who just stick to, you know, whatever it is they know. Elders are the ones who adapt, right? They update, right? But their experience is what becomes increasingly welcome. Draco Cooper Photography say, let's take protesting, for example. When I was in Hong Kong, they had multiple separate protests, million. They had over 200 restaurants providing free food and water to the protesters. Kevin K42 says we have to have a secret society to answer to the open revolution. Azuliism says, can't we out in the open until you get the firepower and means of production? Sorry, he says can't be out in the open until you get the firepower and means of production. Dorico Cooper says, R.I.P. Magufuli. Right? Kevin Kerr says the jackals got Magufuli. So, Rasta says R.I.P. So go back to what Ozuliism says. Experience teaches knowledge. My grandfather always said that. Experience teaches knowledge. And so, that's one of the things we've learned from the past movements is that if you become open revolutionary, you become public enemy. And that leads to, folks getting taken out. So there is there is an aspect where you're going to have to move. You're going to have to move somewhat openly. And when I say somewhat openly, I'm not talking about you're making speeches and all kind of stuff in Liberty Hall. I'm saying, you're going to be on the internet or out in the streets or wherever. You're going to be somewhat open about it. But to really get into revolutionary mode, you have to have firepower to back it up. Dorico Cooper says, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Azuliism says to Dorico Cooper Photography, oldest thing they need to hold power just because they're old with no work behind it. Kevin Kerr says, exactly. Olders live off of that African morality thing and that Christianity thing where you just give respect to people because they're old. And I never, even from a child, I never really gelled with that. That never resonated with me because I knew olders as a kid back home who just wasn't shit, to be honest. Morally bankrupt, incapable of really doing something positive, violent. I've known that since a young age. And so I always looked at what is it that you're doing? I get behind that kind of thing. What are your works? Right? By the way, did y'all see Roland Martin had some kind of statement where I forget the youth's name. I should shout him out because I actually want to see if I can get to interview him. I can't look it up now, but there was a youth who who was getting some notice. The pro-black perspective might know who I'm talking about. They were getting some notice for the work they was doing. They're young, like 20, 21, and they opened a school for boys and stuff like that. And if I'm not mistaken, if I'm not getting two stories mixed up, like Roland Martin was like, what's the problem with being funded by whites and stuff like that? I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you guys familiar with what I'm talking about? I don't want to have to pause and look it up and search it on YouTube right now. Are you guys familiar with what I'm talking about? And folks were getting on Roland and clowning him for it too. You know? I forgot, I can't bother to really find it right now, but if you guys are familiar, talk about that in the chat room. If not, we will end it here. This has been a 3-hour episode. Wow. Rasta just said, the olders' morality comes from the Christian ideology, which equals slaves obey your masters, which is respect for them. The Zuliism posted a link. I'm not sure what the link is. I guess it's the Roland Martin. Right, I guess it's the Roland Martin talk he posted. So you guys can click that link. You guys can click that link where Roland debated this young man on social media about voting. The young man's name is King Randall the First, founder of the X for Boys, right? Which is like a school, and I think a boarding school for boys. And he's like a young guy and did that, which is why people have to question, Umar Johnson a lot, right? Because this kid came along and did it himself in his neighborhood, right? So you guys could check out that link and that Zuliism posted and get an idea for the discussion that was had. In the chat room, Kevin Kerr says Roland Martin is a damn clown. He's still trying to get his job back with CNN. Well, good luck to that, bro. As you guys may have noticed, I already posted. I already scheduled the next podcast, the next broadcast, which will be on Tuesday, which is about Christian slavery, colonialism, and violence. Speaking of Rasta's comment, right, about people, elders taking that Christian mentality of the master and using it for their own benefit. We're going to talk about Christianity, colonialism, and slavery in our Tuesday broadcast. I hope you guys will be available to tune in, always 8 p.m. EST. I like the fact that you guys gave me a bunch of likes today. I appreciate that. I really appreciate the conversation. I appreciate all you guys who were here with me today. As a matter of fact, let me shout out you guys. Zuliism was in the room. Kevin Kerr 42 was here. While I'm giving a shout out, you guys, let me know what you thought of the paper itself. And let me know what you thought of Cabral and the work that he did. We got to give him his respect too, by the way. We got to give him his respect too, right? Apparently, Cabral, let me read this entry from Wikipedia, which goes along with the idea of open revolt to a certain extent. In 1972, Cabral began to form a People's Assembly in preparation for the independence of Guinea-Bissau, but disgruntled former PAIGC rival Inocencio Canai, together with another member of PAIGC, shot and killed him on the 20th of January 1973 in Concord. The possible plan was to arrest Cabral, possibly to judge him summarily later, but facing the peaceful resistance of Cabral, they immediately killed him. According to some theories, Portuguese PIDE agents, whose alleged plan eventually went awry, went to influence Cabral's rivals through agents operating within the PAIGC, in hope of arresting Cabral and placing him under the custody of Portuguese authorities. Another theory claims that Ahmed Sékou Touré, jealous of Cabral's greater international prestige, among other motives, orchestrated the conspiracy. Both theories remain unproven and controversial. After the assassination, about 100 officers and guerrilla soldiers of the PAIGC, accused of involvement in the conspiracy that resulted in the murder of Amilcar Cabral and the attempt to seize power in the movement, were summarily executed. His half-brother Luis Cabral became the leader of the Guinea-Bissau branch of the party and eventually became president of Guinea-Bissau. Less than a month after the assassination, the United States concluded that then colonial power Portugal was not directly involved in his death, according to official documents made public in 2006. Even so, the U.S. State Department's Information and Investigation Services also concluded that Lisbon's complicity in the assassination of the leader of the struggle for Cape Verde's and Guinea-Bissau's independence cannot be ruled out. It's clown talk, right? On 25th of April 1974, the Carnation Revolution coup was carried out in Portugal, which was followed by a ceasefire in the various battlefronts and eventually by the independence of all of Portugal's former colonies in Africa. Cabral was assassinated prior to the independence of the Portuguese colonies in Africa and therefore died before he could see his homelands of Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau gain independence from Portugal. So the question is, should Cabral not have done the work that he did? Of course, he did it openly. You know, this is the thing. I think two things have to happen. You have to do the work, and you have to protect the workers, right? You have to do the work and protect the workers. Kevin Care 42 says to me, make that podcast 4 hours. I can see this being great. Zuliism said he got killed by his own. Let's not forget that. NYC Beauty says to Rasta Diamond. I'm not sure what that is. Rasta said, wow, this is sad. Dorico Cooper Photography says, great work by Amilcar Cabral, R.I.P. Zuliism says, who pulled the trigger? Rasta says, I never knew of him. Wow, great person, hero. Black claps of applause. You know, it's a familiar story. You know, according, Zuliism, you could bet it's people he knew. Right? They said that it was former PAIGCG, I think I got that right, PAIGC, folks, let me read it again. But disgruntled former PAIGC rival, yeah, so someone from his own party, and that's not uncommon. That's not uncommon. And so, again, to go back to that open revolution discussion, unfortunately, you have to do the two things. you gotta put in the work and protect, like I said, protect the workers, right? You have to put in the work and protect the workers, and that's how this thing has to be done. That's the mindset that we have to pick up, right? That's the mindset that we have to pick up. You know, Erzulism says at the end we pulled the trigger. Was Kanye wrong now? About slavery, Kanye was wrong. About the slave mindset, Kanye was not wrong. You know, these men had the Maxim gun, so they took you, and you know, let's be real, right? Some of our folks out here don't like to sleep at night. You think they want to sleep forever? And that's just people in general. Some of us don't like to sleep at night. You think we want to sleep forever? Forever, ever? You know, in other words, death is not this easy choice. In fact, some would say it's not even really a choice, right? So I don't blame the ancestors so much, although there were other peoples who chose death, to be sure. I don't blame the ancestors about that choice that they made to live and fight another day. But the choice of continued mental slavery, like Malcolm X talked about, they'll get one of your people to kill you just to say it was one of your people who killed you, right? That choice. That is a choice, and black folks need to come off of that choice too. Black folks need to come off of that choice too. You know? We gotta stop making these slave choices, right? Rasta says, quote, if our study of black history is merely an exercise in feeling good about ourselves, then we will die feeling good. We must look at the lessons that history teaches us. So yeah, and that's absolutely true. We gotta look at the lessons that history teaches us. Now, we gotta look at Amilcar Cabral, and we gotta honor, his life, because he was on to something, right? He was on to something. And he never got to really see it happen. And that's a shame. Rasta says we must understand the tremendous value of the study of history for the regaining of power. If our education is not about gaining real power, we are being miseducated and misled, and we will die. That's an Amos Wilson quote. And again, I talk about I talk about curriculum all the time, to the point I kind of recently stopped talking about it so much. But, we really got to start working on teaching the future. When you teach the future folks, like what Cabral was doing, for example, do you know we'll have people who will pick up that torch? We'll have people who will say, you know what? I think he was on to something. Let's continue it today. The education that we need to give our people, like we talked about several weeks back, that led to the cryptocurrency discussion that we had earlier in the week. The things that we learned in history about our African tradition, right? The things that we learn in history about our African tradition, we need to start putting that in, the works that we do. I have Erzulism here. I have a couple of photographers here, Derico Cooper and Kevin Care 42, etc. Right? We gotta start depicting these things in the works that we do. Again, those images, when we create our own films and incorporate our historic images and also incorporate some of the thoughts of our elders who have gone before us, right, into the works that we do. That inspires our people, that educates them positively in the future, right? I see in the chat we have a little debate going on. Derico Cooper Photography says, I don't agree with that comment Kanye made. I think he was not clear about what he was saying. Zuliism says, at the end, it is still a choice. Some choose to fight and die. African spirituality and traditions say we don't die. And that is true too, which I always wondered about that. How come the ancestors who were enslaved didn't outright fight and die, knowing that the spirituality says you never really die. You just transition to become an ancestor, right? The living death, right? I always wondered about that. I know Zuliism kind of brought me back to that thought. What do you guys thought on that? If our African spirituality across most African, or most West African, at least, spiritual systems, believed in you don't die really, you know, you live forever as an ancestor, why didn't they choose to fight and die? Derico Cooper Photography says, Dr. Amos N. Wilson changed my whole life. I've heard a lot of people say that, actually. I've heard a lot of people say that. Right? But again, that's a question I'd like to hear you guys broach to try to answer. Rasta, Derico, Kevin Care 42, Daily Affirmations by Pauline, the Pro Black Perspective, whoever is still here, I'd like to get your understanding of that. Like, if Africans believe that, right? According to African spirituality, if Africans believe that you didn't die, you just became, you know, you transformed, became ancestors, then why not fight, right? Why not fight and die as opposed to being enslaved? And that's not to say that Africans did not fight. I want to clear that up too. We got to get off of that too. I don't know if Africans have, in the spirituality system, if there was something against suicide and whatnot, but I'll lean on you guys to fill in those spaces, right? Derico Cooper says, war is best endured as a group. And that's one of the things I've said. I remember me and the Pro Black Perspective had a show together one time. And we briefly talked about it. I think it was the first time I interviewed. And we briefly talked about that. Like, I don't mind dying, but don't have me dying by myself. And y'all ain't do nothing after. Maybe that was a part of it. Like, you know, I'm willing to fight, but are you MFers gonna be watching me die brutally out here? Right? Are you all gonna watch me die brutally by myself and not raise a hand, and then y'all go on living and all that stuff? You know? Zuliism says maybe we didn't really believe in it. Maybe it is all talk. Rasta says to Derico Cooper Photography, yes, me too. Amos Wilson lectures are heavy, but go on study also to Brother Panic and Bobby Hemmett. Hold on, I'm kind of blocked here. Yeah, Panic and so Brother Panic and Bobby Hemmett. They're like the continuation of Amos Wilson. The Zuliism says no, a lot of us fought. Maybe not enough, but a lot fought. Then he laughs his ass off at something I said, I guess. Oh yeah. So then Zuliism says, don't watch me die now. I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, let's be real about that. Right? A lot of people will hesitate to go out there and get their brains blown out or get their entrails spilled. Right? And then you look back in your dying breath and everyone's sitting quiet. You know, maybe things like that happen. Right? Rico Cooper says, war is Zen. 5 combat tours as a Marine, 36 months in combat in a 43-month period, right? War is Zen. So talk about it, Dorico. When you say war is Zen, talk about that a little bit, right? But that's the, that's the thing that I've wondered too about African spirituality system. If that's true, that we had those spirituality systems and beliefs, then why didn't more folks fight and say, well, F it, if I die, I die, right? But I ain't gonna accept this shit and bring into and bring into existence new Africans to be under this shit too, by way of having children, right? That's a heavy question. I bet most people can't really answer that question. And because of that, most people will agree with Kanye and say that it's a choice. Azuliism asks a question, what is Zen? Which I'm kind of wondering too, because Zen is like a practice of meditation, isn't it? So when you use Zen in war is Zen, what do you mean exactly? Being in that environment is the most potent drug ever. I've heard that before. There was a peace officer where I work. I haven't seen him in a while. He's probably on a tour. A white guy. And I remember having not seen him for a while on duty. And when I did see him again, I asked him, what happened to you? And he was like, man, I went over to Iraq. This was back in the day. And I was like, really? And he's a guy, does not look like a soldier. I'm just dropping it real for you. Never viewed him as a soldier type. And then he went missing again, I guess, on a tour. When I saw him again another time, I said, what happened? You went back to war? And he's like, yeah. I was like, why do you go to war, man? He was like, man, it's the greatest thing ever. He said it's a pure rush. And I thought he was just being a white boy, but Rico Cooper is saying that it's the most potent drug ever. He says that he's never been in the moment for a more extended period in his life. Right? He says we live in the past or in the future, but rarely in the present. Brian Jackson. I don't think I've ever seen Brian Jackson here. Brian Jackson says the colonial offerings and trappings are intentionally tempting. How can we fight against anything? Anything we are addicted to? Well, that's the thing. So the colonial offerings and trappings are rewards. You have to out-reward them. And in addition to that, you have to punish those who accept their reward. And you have to out-punish them, right? You have to out-punish the colonizers in terms of their punishment. So it's a tall order, but it's something that we have to get into. We have to learn how to out-reward and out-punish the colonizer. Kevin Care 42 says, the past will depress you. The future will give you anxiety. Ain't that the truth? Rasta says Zen is a part of Buddhism, meaning being fully in the present. Okay, but yeah, I guess meditation is being in the present. Yeah. Okay. So, how do we get on that topic again? That war Zen, right? we were talking about we were going back up. We were talking about why Africans didn't war heavier, didn't fight heavier, right? Than they did. Why didn't they choose death in war than living in subjugation? I still say Kanye was wrong because of the reasons I mentioned. I still say Kanye was wrong because of the reasons I mentioned. If Kanye was talking about, and I think this is what Dorico Cooper Photography was getting at, if Kanye was talking about the mental slavery that a lot of black folks still carry on today, that is a choice. Because listen, I'm here to tell you, let's say we have a Malcolm X type rise up today. I'm not selling out that brother. You can't pay me enough to go pull a trigger, right, and gun down that brother. It's like the guys who killed Malcolm, they made a choice to do that shit. Right? Yeah, the cops might have been behind it too, but they made a choice to work with him. And what's so silly about that shit in Malcolm's case? Most of these dudes still went to jail. Zuliism says, I think you gotta reject what they are offering. Like a diabetic should reject sugar. Brian Jackson says we have to have a bigger carrot and a bigger stick. Brilliant. Thank you for those gems, good brother. Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. You have to, I mean, it's the same thing with, like, you know, same thing kind of sort of with relationships, right? Which is one of the things I have a problem with relationships. You always have to outdo yourself, right? You always have to outdo yourself, whether it's giving or receiving. You always have to outdo yourself, right? Kevin Care 42 says 1,000% truth. Ross, you know, he said it to Kevin Care 42. Rasta said we do it by not fighting their fight, which using machines. We fight on another level where they cannot reach. We fight with our mind and magic, specifically on the spiritual realms. Oh boy, Rasta. Here we go again. Rasta says when we create on the spirit realm, it manifests automatically on the physical realm. This is how to defeat them. I know where Rasta is coming from, by the way. I know well where he or she is coming from. I'll be honest with you, Rasta. I gave that up a long time ago. I gave that up a long time ago. At the end of the day, and here's why. I gave that up because of we are some of the most religious and some mix of religion and spirituality. Let me tell you something. We are the biggest supporters of spirituality and religion. Right? And I don't care what sign of the cross, sign of the Yank, sign of the King David star. I don't care what you do there. Their machines will take you up. We gotta fight with machines too, man. This is why a lot of people don't like it, but I say this about even like capitalism, right? Capitalism is the way of the world right now. And unfortunately, these savages have made it something savage. Right? So I get why, you know, historically and even contemporarily, folks won't like capitalism. But guess what? That's the system that's about right now. The best thing you can do is play the game, learn how to fight in the system. This is what the discussion, to me at least, that I had with Dorico Cooper Photography and Kevin Care 42 and Machiavelli and A-Love Supreme the other night. This is what I was really thinking about during the conversation. Is like, we are talking about this cryptocurrency and blockchain and all this stuff so that we can influence our folks to get in the game and start to empower yourself monetarily. You got to play the game. You can't be getting your ass whooped in basketball and say, hey, fuck it, let's play soccer. You getting your ass whooped in basketball, you got to play better ball. Right? Rico Cooper said the metaphysical war. Kevin Cara 42 says the cross-dresser J. Edgar Hoover was scared of a black messiah. By the way, Hoover using the term black messiah was very strategic too. He understood that you know, that message was going to get out, and he understood what it meant. Right? Israelism says to Rasta, by spiritual realm, do you mean black magic? Rasta says, I know, but we should fight on both levels, economically and spiritually. Well, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to knock spirituality per se, but I'm saying that spiritual warfare in the face of their machines will only probably help you transition better to an ancestor. You got to get on that military might. You got to get on the economics. You have to get on everything. And black folks, as it stands, tend to be afraid to get on the things that they need to get on. Let me tell you something. Walking around with a Bob Marley t-shirt, right, and smoking herb and blessing everyone, that's cool. Right? Like I said, I gave that stuff up a while. That's cool. But at the end of the day, when you're out here a pauper, I'm talking pauper in terms of economics and even military might, right? You'll just be out here a dead fool. A lot of that stuff is well-meaning, but you'll end up here a fool. When you guys post links in the chat, let us know what the link is, please. Like, tell us what it is, then post the link, so we can know. Kevin Care says, remember before King James edited the Bible, he wrote a book called Demonology. Rasta says to Erzuliism, all of that. We should use everything we have in our power. Erzuliism says you cannot fight in the system with the system, because who creates the money? Who creates the mint machines? Erzuliism, I think you might have missed the last episode we did. There's a way right now with decentralization through cryptocurrency and stuff. If you get on board, there's a way that you can perhaps increase your abundance. The point I'm making is that I'm not telling you that you could use capitalism to defeat capitalism. This is not Thanos who used the stones to destroy the stones. I'm saying you use capitalism to empower yourself, starting with you and your family and your community and your local communities. Claude Anderson had that analogy that he used that I can't remember all of it now, but you make your money and you buy your politics or your politicians. I will add, you buy your defenses. And by the way, I'm talking about the continent of Africa. I'm talking about a place where there's more Africans in it, right, than what we have, say, here in America, or what we have in the Caribbean, right? You have to build your military might. You got to start making that money and using it for the care and protection of your people. That's what I'm talking about. Brian Jackson says we can win through a combination of resource acquisition, boom, mental, physical, and spiritual warfare. But we cannot merely engage in spiritual escapism and expect to win. Right there, he wins comment of the night. They destroyed Oklahoma, quite frankly, because Oklahoma built affluence and decadence and didn't build up any kind of might. Let me tell y'all something. If I'm a guy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? I've said this on the show before, and I stand by this. No little sharecropping white boy is gonna come and blow me out with his rifle. Unable to blow me out until they could send in, air forces to bomb me. No way. Those guys were more concerned with building a gang of churches and all kind of stuff like that. Again, spiritual warfare, as opposed to get serious and get your might up. Now again, we be talking about populations within a nation. We're talking about a black population within a white nation. There's only so much military might you can put up. But you ain't gonna just take me out just like that. I'm drawing the line, you cross it. All these dudes wearing zoot suits and all kind of shit, not one gun, just one gun between, every 10 of them or something like that. Right? When you ran down to a train track. I mean, what the fuck you ran down to a train track for? Except to jump on the train and haul ass out of it. They didn't firm up themselves. Where there's money, there's armament. You have to firm up yourself. Right? And this is why the argument for building Africa first before anything else comes up. Because you're just a small nation in a white person's, a small population in a white person's nation, right? Kevin Kerr, speaking of cryptocurrency, many banks are closing down. When and if that new $4 trillion stimulus passes, it will further devalue the dollar. Rasta says, right, LOL. Then he says, not funny, damn it. I get it. Trust me, I was a believer in all that type of stuff before. But you don't really build a nation with that belief. I'm telling you, you could build a community, you could build a camp, you could build up on a hill, right? But it's just struggle that's happening. We got to get off that struggle. Kevin Kerr says this is about many banks closing down at Bitter Medicine Podcast. Zuliism says, oh, gotcha. Ray Diallo is saying that governments are trying to make crypto illegal, but it will not work. Yeah, I posted that in the off topics. In the off topics channel on Discord, a little article with Ray Diallo saying that they're probably going to outlaw Bitcoin, right? We'll see. Oklahoma had guns. They didn't have enough of them. Derico Cooper Photography says that will never happen. That is just to create dips in the cryptocurrencies so whales can buy more at a discount. That's what I thought too, Derico. That's exactly what I thought too. Azuliism said they just didn't count for the government would join in to destroy them. That's what I'm saying. You can't, ultimately as a population within a nation, you can't beat their government. You can't beat their military might. But what I'm telling you, Before the government could have come in and helped destroy me in Oklahoma, some of them sharecropping white boys would have felt it. Trust me. Right? Blacks in Tulsa, Oklahoma need air superior. Exactly. They needed a way to take down planes and whatnot. So this is why I always say when you build up your economic base, you got to build up your military base. That's the one thing I differ with Claude Anderson's 5 levels analogy, which I don't remember all the levels now, but that's one thing I disagree with him about. Because he's working on the assumption that you're integrated or integrating into a white nation. But the idea is that will never work. You're not going to integrate it into their nation. So if you're going to just be a population within their nation, you have to give yourself a better chance. I'll put it like that. And again, in America, it's going to be hard for you to give yourself that better chance. That's why ultimately our folks got to get out of here. But what America is good for is getting some resources. Ask any immigrant who comes to America. America is good for getting some resources. You stack your paper and you get up out of here and you go and build. Right? The African dream is the Mzungu nightmare. In the lectures of Amos Wilson, he mentioned change your consciousness and you change your circumstances, not only as individuals, but as this applies for a group as well, because as Kanye said, it's a choice. That's Rasta. Rasta also says to feel defeated or not. Goes on to say these were some of the lectures given by Dr. Amos on the African mindset. And this is partly metaphysical as well. Dorico Cooper says the African dream is the Mzungu nightmare, quoting Kevin Care 42, saying that he loves that. Rasta says it is about programming the mind. Zuluism says to Kevin Care 42, damn son, the future brings anxiety. Kevin Care says the thing about Mzungu society is that they ask a question, when you have the answer, they change the question. All right. I've gone on a very long time in this broadcast. I try to keep these broadcasts a certain length because I don't want casual listeners to see, oh, this is 4 hours. I'm not listening to 4 hours. But sometimes it is necessary depending on the paper, depending on the discussion. I appreciate you guys for tuning in tonight. And again, I want to thank you all for being here. I don't think all of you added what you thought of the paper that was read itself. We've had all these other conversations. Zuluism says, great show. Thank you. Dorico Cooper says, bait and switch, referring to the previous Kevin Care 42 comment. Dorico Cooper also says, amazing. I appreciate all the feedback. Let me go through and shout out everyone who was here. Dorico Cooper Photography was here. Rasta was here. Zuluism was here. We had NYC Beauties in the room. I think Black Excellence was here earlier. KW Dawn 7 was here. Brian Jackson seems to have been here. Who else was here? Daily Affirmations by Pauline was here. The Pro-Black Perspective was here. I want to thank all you guys for being here and tuning in. Really want to thank all you regulars who always show up. I appreciate you guys. You guys make it worth it. Right? And I want to say that I'll be here again on Tuesday night Tuesday night, we will be discussing Christianity, colonialism, and I think racism it is. I'll be talking about the narrative of a former slave in that reading. So you guys make sure to tune in. If you're new here and you haven't done so yet, please like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified when I'm on again. And until next time, guys, you guys be good. Peace and prosperity to all of you. I'll see you soon, all right? Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.